She wasn't sold to a monster. She was given to the only man willing to die for the truth her father had buried for 20 years. The night the debt collectors showed up with guns, Isla Mercer thought her life was over. But the man who emerged from the shadows wasn't an enemy. He held the key to a secret that could wipe out an entire empire. And that secret bore her father's name. Press like and comment the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Don't miss a second. The night it happened, Isla Mercer was standing in the dark at the top of the staircase with a flashlight in one hand and a letter opener in the other. Not a knife. A letter opener. Silver-plated, engraved with her mother's initials, dull as a butter knife along both edges. She'd grabbed it off the hall table because it was the first thing her hand found in the blackout, and now she stood there holding it like it meant something, listening to the sounds coming through the walls of the estate. Men's voices, low and precise, the crunch of boots on the gravel drive, and underneath all of it, a sound she'd never heard before in 28 years of living inside this house. The sound of her mother not moving. Eleanor Mercer hadn't spoken in 4 minutes. Isla knew because she'd been counting. Her mother was somewhere on the ground floor, probably in the sitting room where she went when she couldn't sleep, and the last thing Isla had heard from her was a single sharp intake of breath followed by absolute silence. That silence was worse than a scream. Eleanor Mercer had survived a husband's disappearing act, 2 rounds of bankruptcy filings, and the slow humiliation of watching a family name get picked apart by creditors for 3 years running. She didn't scare easy. The fact that she'd gone quiet meant whatever was outside that door was the kind of thing that made even Eleanor go quiet. Isla pressed her back against the wall and killed the flashlight. The estate, Mercer Hall, though no one had called it that in years, not since the money stopped, sat on 11 acres of Connecticut woodland, 40 minutes from the nearest highway, and tonight the power was out. Not just their power. The whole road had gone dark 20 minutes ago, which meant either a transformer had blown or someone had cut something deliberately. Isla had her suspicions about which one it was. 3 weeks ago, a man named Gerald Pruitt had shown up at the front door in a gray suit and offered her family a choice between selling the property and what he described, with a salesman's smile, as alternative remedies for debt resolution. Isla had recognized the language for what it was. She'd spent 6 years as a data intelligence analyst at Hargrove Systems, one of the most aggressive technology contractors in the Northeastern Corridor, and she'd seen that kind of euphemism deployed in financial documents the way other people deployed weather as small talk. It meant nothing good. It meant men with a plan. She'd told Pruitt to get off the property. He'd left without argument, which should have been the first warning sign. Men like that didn't leave without argument unless they already knew they were coming back. Now there were headlights sweeping across the upper windows from the driveway. Not one set, but multiple, moving in a practiced formation that had nothing to do with guests. Isla counted 3 vehicles through the gap in the curtains. Dark SUVs, no plates visible, and Pruitt's gray sedan parked sideways across the iron gate like it belonged there, like the gate was something he'd already decided was his. She heard the front door, not a knock. The creak of hinges, which meant someone had opened it from the outside, which meant someone had either picked the lock or had a key, and neither option was survivable by a woman standing in the dark with a letter opener. "Mom." She kept her voice barely above a breath. "Mom, I need you to answer me." Nothing. Isla moved down the staircase the way her father had taught her when she was 7 years old, testing each step before committing weight, keeping to the outer edge where the boards didn't groan. Nathan Mercer had taught her a lot of things. How to read a room, how to recognize when someone was lying by the way they positioned their hands, how to disappear in a crowd, and how to listen for the sound underneath the sound a person was making. She hadn't thought about any of those lessons in years. They came back now the way muscle memory always did, uninvited and suddenly essential. The sitting room was at the end of the east corridor. The front door, now open, was on her left. She could feel the night air coming through it, cold and wet with the smell of recent rain. She found her mother standing at the window of the sitting room with her hands clasped in front of her stomach and her face completely still. Eleanor Mercer was 61 years old and had the posture of a woman who'd decided years ago that collapsing was not a viable option. She was watching something outside, and her expression was the expression of someone watching a fire they can't put out. There are at least 7 of them, Eleanor said, without turning around. I've been counting the cigarettes. The ones near the east fence have been smoking. We need to get to the back of the house. They're at the back of the house, Isla. Isla went to the window and looked. Her mother was right. The lawn behind the estate was dotted with moving shapes, flashlight beams cutting low across the grass with the practiced efficiency of people who did this kind of thing regularly. They weren't running, they weren't shouting. That was the part that made her stomach drop. The absolute professionalism of it. Panicked men made noise. Men who were confident they had time made no noise at all. Pruitt's not just collecting a debt, Isla said. No. Eleanor finally turned from the window. In the darkness, her face was composed, but her hands were shaking very slightly down at her sides. He isn't. Did you call someone? The phones are dead. Cell signal's been jammed. I tried your brother's number 6 times. Daniel was in Boston, 3 hours away and completely unreachable, which meant he was as safe as anyone was going to be tonight, and also completely useless. Isla looked around the sitting room, the antique furniture, the framed photographs on the mantel, 20 years of a family's collected objects, and calculated the distance to every exit and found every exit compromised. The first gunshot came from outside, and it was answered almost immediately by 3 more. Eleanor didn't flinch, which told Isla she'd already accepted the possibility of this ending badly. Isla flinched enough for both of them. She grabbed her mother's arm and pulled her toward the interior of the house, toward the old butler's pantry that connected to the kitchen, which was the only room in the estate without windows on the ground level, when the front of the house exploded in light, not fire. Headlights. Powerful ones. The kind that turned night into something approximating noon. And with them came the sound of engines. Different engines than the ones that had been idling in the drive. These were heavier. More of them. And moving fast. Isla pressed herself to the wall of the corridor and watched through the glass panel beside the front door as 3 black SUVs came through the iron gate at speed, scattering Pruitt's sedan sideways like it was made of cardboard. The vehicles spread across the front lawn in a coordinated arc. Doors opened before the vehicles had fully stopped. Men in dark tactical clothing fanned out into the darkness, and the sounds from outside changed immediately. The confident silence of Pruitt's people cracked into something urgent and disorganized. More gunshots. A shout that cut off midway through a word. The thud of something heavy hitting the ground. Then quiet again. Different quiet. The kind that came after rather than before. One of the front vehicles idled at the base of the front steps. Its door opened. The man who stepped out was tall enough that Isla noticed it before anything else. The way he occupied vertical space differently than other men. Not from bulk, but from a kind of deliberate stillness that made the space around him seem smaller. He was wearing a dark coat, no tie, and he moved up the front steps of the estate without hurry, without looking around at the aftermath on the lawn, as if none of what had just happened was remotely surprising or interesting to him. He knocked 3 times. Not like someone asking permission, like someone stating a fact. Isla and her mother stood at the end of the corridor and did not move. He knocked again. Miss Mercer. His voice carried through the door without effort, low and unhurried. My name is Vincent Ashcroft. I have no interest in hurting either of you, and I have approximately 4 minutes before local law enforcement responds to the reported disturbance at your gate. I'd like to use that time productively. Please open the door. Isla knew that name. Everyone in her industry knew that name, the way everyone knew certain weather systems by name. Not because they'd ever experienced them directly, but because the damage reports were thorough and unambiguous. Vincent Ashcroft. 43 years old, publicly listed as the founder and managing director of Ashcroft Capital Partners, a private investment firm headquartered in Lower Manhattan with holdings across 11 countries. Privately known as something else entirely. The kind of organization that a firm like Hargrove Systems hired to solve problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. The kind of man that sophisticated, expensive people were afraid of. The kind of man Gerald Pruitt had apparently just gone to war with and lost in under 6 minutes. Don't, Eleanor said quietly. I know. Isla looked at the door and then at her mother, and then at the letter opener still in her hand, which she registered for the first time as genuinely, comprehensively useless. She set it down on the hall table. But Pruitt's people are either dead or gone, and whoever Ashcroft brought with him is still outside, and we don't have anywhere to go. She opened the door. Vincent Ashcroft in person was not what the rumors suggested, which was the first thing Isla filed away because she'd spent 6 years filing details about people, and the habit was involuntary. The rumors described something predatory. What she saw at her doorstep was something more controlled than that. He was lean rather than imposing, dark-eyed, and his face had the quality of a man who'd learned a long time ago that most expressions cost more than they were worth. He looked at her with a directness that was not threatening and not warm, and was somehow more unsettling than either. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Neither are you," she said. "What did you do with Pruitt?" "He's alive. He'll be moved to a facility where he'll be significantly less mobile for a while." He said it the way someone described a minor administrative inconvenience. "May I come in?" "No." She stayed in the doorway. "Whatever you want, you can say it from there." Something moved briefly across his face. Not amusement, not annoyance. Closer to recalibration. He looked at her for a moment the way a person looks at a problem they've underestimated. "Your family's debt to Pruitt's organization totals approximately $2.3 million in principal and accumulated interest," he said. "As of 40 minutes ago, I've purchased that debt in full. Pruitt's claim against this property is void. Your family is no longer in any immediate financial danger." Behind her, Isla heard her mother's breath change. "Why?" Isla said. "Because I need something from you." "What?" He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a photograph. He held it out toward her between 2 fingers, and she took it because not taking it felt like the kind of weakness she couldn't afford right now. It was a surveillance image, the resolution sharp enough to have come from professional equipment, black and white, showing the exterior of a building she didn't immediately recognize. A server facility of some kind. Industrial, windowless, stamped in the lower right corner with a date from 19 years ago. "That building no longer exists," Vincent said. "It was demolished in what was officially documented as a controlled demolition following structural concerns. What was inside that building before it was demolished was the reason my father was killed." Isla looked at the photograph and then at him. "What does this have to do with me?" "Everything inside that building was wiped before demolition. Every server, every drive, every file. Except that the people who ordered the wipe didn't account for the fact that data intelligence systems of that era had passive redundancy protocols that logged to external nodes. Those nodes are still active. They're dormant, but they're intact, and the access architecture requires a specific kind of analyst." He paused. "The kind of analyst who spent 3 years designing infiltration frameworks for encrypted legacy systems at Hargrove Systems. The kind who was let go 14 months ago when the project she was running got classified above her clearance level and she was deemed a liability." The air between them changed. "You've been watching me," she said. "I've been watching a lot of people. You're the only one who can do what I need. I don't work for criminal organizations." "You worked for Hargrove Systems for 6 years," he said. "The line between those two things is thinner than you'd like to believe." She almost closed the door in his face. She thought about it. She could feel her mother behind her and the dark house around them and the sounds of the estate settling in the aftermath of whatever had just happened on the lawn. And she thought about Pruitt's gray sedan and the 3 years of notices and the way the family solicitor had stopped returning calls in January. And she thought about the letter opener on the hall table. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said. "Find out who murdered my father," Vincent said. "And prove it." She stood in the doorway of the house her grandfather had built, and her father had nearly bankrupted, and her mother had spent 3 years refusing to surrender, and she looked at Vincent Ashcroft's face for the truth of him. Not for warmth, not for safety, for the specific quality she'd learned to identify in 6 years of working alongside people who operated in the margins of legal accountability. The quality of a man who meant what he said. She found it. That was the thing she would think about later. She found it. "My mother and brother," she said. "If I do this, they're protected, not managed. Protected. I'll know the difference." "Yes. I want it in writing." You'll have it within the hour. And if I find something you don't want to find? He didn't hesitate. Then you tell me anyway. Isla stepped back from the door and let him in. Eleanor Mercer watched from the end of the corridor as Vincent Ashcroft crossed the threshold of Mercer Hall for the first time. And her face held an expression that Isla couldn't read until much later. Not quite fear, not quite recognition. Something older than both. The expression of a woman who'd been waiting for a particular reckoning and had finally heard it knock. By 4 a.m, the family had been moved. 3 vehicles, a route that changed twice for reasons Vincent's people didn't explain, and a destination that revealed itself only as they climbed into Connecticut's northern hills. A compound that sat behind a tree line deep enough to swallow sound entirely. Stone construction, modern security, the kind of place that existed completely off any map Isla had ever encountered. Her mother was given a room on the 2nd floor and was quiet with a kind of dignity that Isla recognized as grief for a version of their life that was now completely over. Daniel was reached by satellite phone at midnight and informed that his family had been relocated for safety reasons, a conversation that produced 45 minutes of sustained panic before Eleanor took the phone and told him in a voice like poured concrete that everything was handled and he should not come. Isla was given a workspace on the ground floor, a room with no windows and 2 locked servers, and a terminal that had been wiped and rebuilt from a baseline that wasn't commercial, the kind of setup that cost more than most people's houses, the kind that said, quietly, that whoever had assembled this had known exactly what they were doing. She sat at the terminal for a long time without turning it on. On the table beside it, in a plain cardboard folder, was the first file Vincent had left for her. Not a briefing document, not an organizational chart, a timeline, handwritten, 19 pages long that tracked the movements of a man named Robert Ashcroft across 7 months prior to his death. Every page was annotated in a different hand than the one that had written the original entries. Older ink, more hesitant, the handwriting of a man returning to something he'd put down and couldn't quite bring himself to finish. Isla opened the folder and read for 3 hours without stopping. Robert Ashcroft had been, by the record she was reading, a systems architect at a defense technology firm called Viridian Solutions, which had operated out of a facility in upstate New York in the mid-2000s and had been acquired by a larger conglomerate called Proximate Technologies, in a deal that closed approximately 11 months after Robert Ashcroft's officially documented death by carbon monoxide poisoning in a parking structure. The official record was clean. The annotated timeline was not. The annotations described meetings that didn't appear in any calendar, payments that moved through shell entities, a specific software project, referenced only by a codename, Meridian, that Robert had apparently been preparing to take to federal authorities in the weeks before he died. She found the first anomaly on page 7, a date, circled in the older ink with a single word written beside it in the margin. The word was Nathan. Isla sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of the windowless room and let the silence hold her for a moment. Then she picked up the folder and started again from page 1. She didn't sleep that night. She was still reading when the first gray light of morning pushed through the gap under the door, and she was still at the table when Vincent knocked twice and entered without waiting. He looked at the spread of papers across the desk, at the notes she'd already begun making in the margins of her own legal pad, at the 3 empty coffee cups arranged in a row like a small civilian monument to sustained effort. He looked at her face. "You found something," he said. "I found a lot of things." She kept her voice level. "Most of them are going to take weeks to verify. The encrypted node architecture you mentioned is real. I can see the ghost signatures in the network topology. Getting inside it isn't impossible, but it's not a weekend project." "What about the name in the margin?" She met his eyes. "I don't know what it means yet." He looked at her for a moment with the same directness he'd used on her doorstep, the same quality of attention that felt less like scrutiny and more like calculation. "But you have a theory." "I have a lot of theories. None of them are facts yet." "That's not what I asked." Isla set down her pen. Outside, somewhere in the compound, she could hear the sound of other people moving through morning routines. Quiet, professional, the ambient texture of an organization that ran itself with the minimum necessary noise. She thought about her father, about the handwriting in the margins, about the specific shape of a coincidence that didn't feel like one. "The name in the margin is a common name," she said carefully. "It could mean anything." "Miss Mercer, I need more time." "You'll have it." He moved toward the door and then stopped with his hand on the frame, his back to her. "My father wrote most of those annotations himself, the ones in the older ink. He started going back through the original timeline about 2 years before he died. He was trying to figure out who else knew what he knew." A pause. "He never told me what he found. He died before he finished." He left without turning around, and Isla sat in the fluorescent quiet of the windowless room and looked at the circled name on page 7 and understood, with the particular cold clarity of someone trained to recognize patterns, that she was very possibly standing at the edge of the worst thing she would ever find. She picked up her pen and wrote the word Nathan at the top of her legal pad. Then she drew a circle around it, the same way the dead man had, and started building the map of what it connected to. 3 days in, she found the first server node. Not accessed it, found it, the way you find the outline of something buried by tracking what the ground around it does. The node was registered to a defunct logistics company in New Jersey, dissolving in 2009, but its network signature was still live, pinging twice daily to an address that resolved through 4 different jurisdictional shells before disappearing into a dark endpoint she'd need specialized hardware to reach. She told Vincent at dinner. They ate in the same room, across from each other at a table that had clearly not been designed for intimacy, and the meals were functional rather than social, food that appeared and got consumed and cleared without ceremony. She told him about the node and what she'd need, and he nodded once and said it would be on her desk by morning. It was. She found the second node on day 6. On day 9, she found the folder in his private office, not through snooping. He brought her there to show her something in a file he'd pulled, and while he was reading, her eye snagged on the open safe behind his desk. Not what was inside it. The safe was too far away, and the angle was wrong. What she noticed was the corner of an envelope, an old one, the kind with a particular texture that came from handwriting done under pressure, when the pen pressed deeper than it needed to. There were many of them, a stack of them, bound with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. She didn't ask. Not yet. She noted the shape of them and filed it and returned to the work. On day 11, while Vincent was off-site, and she was alone in the main building with 2 of his people posted outside, she asked the man named Craw, quiet, 40s, the one who brought her coffee without being asked, if the office was accessible. "The safe's locked," he said. It wasn't a refusal, it was information. "I know," she said. "I just need the desk." There's a reference file he mentioned was in the right-hand drawer. Craw thought about it. Then he unlocked the office and stood in the doorway while she went to the desk. She found what she'd told him she was looking for. It was actually there, which she hadn't been certain of. But while she was retrieving it, she let her hand rest for one moment on the front face of the safe. The letters inside it were from Robert Ashcroft. She didn't know that yet. She would know it soon because 3 days later, Vincent would open the safe in her presence and hand her the stack without explanation, and she would read the first letter and find inside it a sentence that made the room go sideways. But that was later. That night, on day 11, Isla Mercer sat in her windowless room with the network map spreading across 3 monitors and the legal pad filling with connections, and her father's name appearing now in 4 separate places in the documentation. Not just the margin note, not just a coincidence. 4 places, each one in a different year, each one in a document that had no business containing the name of a Connecticut technology consultant with no defense industry affiliation. And she felt the investigation shift beneath her like ground that had been solid until it wasn't. She'd been hired to find who killed Vincent's father. She was beginning to understand that what she might actually find was what her own father had done to keep that murder buried. She turned off the monitors one by one in the dark and sat with that understanding for a long time before she decided, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had always needed to know the shape of the thing that was going to hurt her, that she was going to keep going anyway. In the morning, she turned the monitors back on, and on day 14, Vincent opened the safe. Vincent didn't make a ceremony of it. He crossed the office in 4 steps, crouched in front of the safe with his back to her, worked the combination by feel rather than sight, the motion of a man who'd done it 10,000 times in the dark. And when the door swung open, he reached inside and removed the stack of envelopes and set them on the desk between them without comment. Isla looked at the stack, then at him. My father wrote them over a period of about 8 months, Vincent said. He sat down in the chair across from her, not behind the desk, beside it, which she noticed because it changed the geometry of the room from interrogation to something else she didn't have a clean word for. He didn't send them. He addressed them, but he never sent them. To who? To whoever found the truth. He leaned back. He didn't know who that would be. He just knew someone eventually would. Isla pulled the stack toward her. The rubber band crumbled when she touched it. Not broke, crumbled, the kind of disintegration that only came from years of slow, dry rot. She set the band aside and looked at the top envelope. The address line read, in handwriting that slanted left under pressure, for the person who comes after. How long have you had these? Since the week after he died. I found them in a lockbox he kept at a storage facility in White Plains. It took me 6 months to find the facility. Something moved behind his eyes and went still again. He didn't make it easy. I think he was afraid I'd find them before I was ready. Ready for what? To know he was scared. She opened the first letter. The handwriting inside was different from the address, so looser, faster, the handwriting of a man thinking at the speed of the pen rather than composing. The date at the top was 19 years ago, late October, 2 months before Robert Ashcroft's official death by carbon monoxide in a parking structure in Westchester County. I don't know how much time I have, so I'm going to write what I know and not what I can prove. Because the proof is in the system, and the system has people inside it who will destroy the proof before it reaches anyone who matters. What I know is this: Meridian is not a defense contract, it is a theft. It is the most sophisticated piece of offensive surveillance software ever built by a private firm, and the people who built it do not intend to sell it to the government. They intend to use it themselves, to collect, to control, to own. The man whose name I cannot write here, you will find him eventually. He leaves traces. All powerful men do. They can't help it. Has been positioning for 7 years to acquire this capability, and he will not allow anyone who knows what it actually is to survive that acquisition. Isla read to the end of the first letter and then set it face down on the desk and looked at the window. There were windows in Vincent's office, real ones, looking out over the rear grounds where the tree line stood dark and impenetrable in the gray morning, and breathed. He knew, she said. He knew. How long before his death did he figure out he was going to be killed? From the dates on the letters, about 3 months. And he didn't go to authorities. Vincent's jaw tightened barely. He tried. He made contact with a federal investigator through a back channel. The investigator's name was listed in his personal files. 11 days after my father made contact, that investigator was reassigned to a field office in Alaska, and his caseload was transferred. Every piece of documentation my father had given him disappeared from the record. Someone inside the federal structure was running cover. Or someone was paying someone inside the federal structure to run cover, which is a different problem with a different solution. Isla stacked the remaining letters without opening them. There were 22 of them. She'd read them all, but not here, not with him watching her face while she did it. I need to take these to my workspace. They don't leave this building. Then I need to work in here. He looked at her for a moment. All right. She sat up at the side table with her legal pad and worked through the letters in chronological order, and Vincent stayed in the room, not hovering, not watching, but present, reading his own documents at the desk with the particular focused silence of a man who'd learned that being in the same room as something didn't mean you had to perform a reaction to it. After 2 hours, Isla had filled 9 pages of notes and found the name Nathan 3 more times across 4 letters. The first 2 instances were contextual. Robert Ashcroft wrote about a contact at a firm called Mercer Analytics, who had helped him route data through a secondary server structure without official documentation, a favor that Robert described as having been done in good faith by someone who didn't know the full scope of what he was moving. The third instance was different. The man from Mercer Analytics came to see me 3 weeks ago. I'll call him N here. He is not a bad man. I want to be clear about that because if these letters ever reach someone looking for villains, he isn't one. He's a man who made a decision under duress and then had to live with it, which is a different category of human failing than the ones we're more comfortable condemning. N told me that he was approached in the weeks following the incident and given a choice that wasn't a choice: cooperate or watch his family destroyed. His wife, his daughter, his infant son. He cooperated. He buried what he saw. And then for years he tried to find a way to unbury it without getting all of them killed. He hasn't found it yet. I don't know if he ever will, but he is trying, and I think that matters even when the outcome doesn't change. Isla put the letter down very carefully on the table and did not move for a long moment. Her father had been to see Robert Ashcroft 3 weeks before Robert died. Her father had been there, had looked him in the eye, had told him what he'd done. And Robert, who had been counting down the days of his own life and knew it, had written about Nathan Mercer with more grace than Nathan Mercer's own daughter currently felt capable of. "I need some water," she said. Vincent looked up. He read her face without asking about it. He poured water from the carafe on his desk and set it in front of her without comment, and she drank it and didn't thank him, and he went back to his documents. She picked up the next letter. The argument happened on day 17, and it started the way the worst arguments always started. Not with the thing that actually mattered, but with something small and logistical that had been stretched thin enough by accumulated tension to finally tear. It started with Craw. Craw had, without consulting her, transferred 3 of her working files to a secondary server for what he described as routine backup protocol. The files were encrypted and the transfer was technically secure and nothing had been compromised. None of that mattered to Isla because the files contained her working notes on the Nathan connection, and she hadn't told Vincent about the Nathan connection yet, not fully, not in the way that acknowledged what she now believed it meant. And having those files somewhere she didn't control felt like standing on ice that had just developed a sound. She went to Vincent directly. She didn't send a message through Craw or wait for their next scheduled briefing. She walked into the main operations room where he was running what appeared to be a separate coordinated effort with 4 of his people, and she said, in front of all of them, "I need to talk to you. Now." He looked at her. He said something brief to the man beside him and then walked her into the corridor. "Craw moved my files," she said. "I know. I authorized it." "You authorized it without telling me." "It was a security precaution. The primary server had an anomalous ping 2 nights ago that suggested, I don't care what it suggested. Those files contain active analytical work, and active analytical work doesn't get touched without my knowledge. That's not a preference. It's a methodology. If the methodology gets contaminated by outside intervention, then the findings get contaminated, and the findings are the only thing I'm here to produce. Do you understand that?" He looked at her for a moment. The corridor was narrow, and he was close enough that she could see the specific quality of his attention shift, from operational to something more direct. "The anomalous ping was a probe," he said. "Someone is aware you're working in this network. If I'd waited to consult you, the files would have been exposed." "Then you tell me and we make the decision together." There wasn't time. There's always time for a 30-second conversation. Not at 3 in the morning when you're asleep and the window is 11 minutes. She stopped. "Someone probed the network at 3 in the morning. "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "I'm telling you now." "That's not the same thing." She held his gaze. "Who knows I'm here, Vincent? Who knows what I'm working on?" His silence lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have. That was enough. "Who?" she said again, and her voice had gone flat in the way that happened when fear got compressed into something harder. "There are people within my own organization who know the investigation was reopened," he said. "Not the specifics, not you specifically, but the general shape of it. You have a leak." "Possibly." "Not possibly. That probe was targeted. Whoever ran it knew there was active work in that server cluster, which means they knew to look there, which means someone told them." She turned and walked back toward her workspace, and he followed her. "I need the full network access log for the past 3 weeks, not the filtered version Craw runs. The raw log." "That's not—" "I'm not asking." He stopped in the doorway of her workspace. She was already at the terminal. She could feel him behind her, the particular weight of a man deciding whether to be managed or not, and she didn't turn around. "I'll have it to you within the hour," he said. 20 minutes. He left. She got the raw log in 18 minutes. She worked through it for 6 hours without stopping, cross-referencing the probe signatures against the network topology she'd built over the previous 2 weeks. And at the end of those 6 hours, she had a profile on the probe's origin that was incomplete but directional. The signal had bounced through 7 relay points, but the degradation pattern was inconsistent with commercial routing, which meant either the person running it had access to proprietary relay infrastructure, or they were working inside a network that already had those resources built in. She thought about Hargrove Systems. She thought about the kind of firms that grew from the same substrate as Hargrove, defense-adjacent, data-heavy, accountability-light. She thought about Proximate Technologies and the acquisition of Viridian Solutions and the code name Meridian. She thought about a software package so valuable that people had killed to control it 19 years ago and presumably hadn't stopped caring about it since. She wrote 3 words at the top of a new page. Someone is watching. Then she wrote 2 more below. Already was. Vincent came back at 7 in the evening with food he'd apparently made himself, which surprised her enough that she looked up from the terminal. It was plain. Rice. Something braised. Nothing that required conversation to consume. He set it beside her keyboard and pulled the second chair to the corner of the desk rather than across from her. The probe came from inside a proprietary relay network, she said without preamble. I know. You ran your own analysis. My people did. We came to the same conclusion 4 hours ago. He picked up his own plate. I didn't want to interfere with yours. Because you wanted to see if I'd get there independently. Because I wanted to know if we were looking at the same picture. He ate. She ate. The room was quiet in the particular way of 2 people thinking in parallel. What does your picture look like? Someone with resources, existing infrastructure, not a new player who's responding to the reopened investigation, someone who's been watching this space for a long time and noticed activity. She set down her fork. This isn't Pruitt. Pruitt was a debt collector with delusions of capability. Whoever ran that probe has completely different resources, different reach. Yes. You knew this already. Before you came to me, you knew the investigation was going to attract this kind of attention. I knew it was possible. That's not the same as telling me. He looked at her. Would you have said yes if I had? She didn't answer because the honest answer was that she didn't know, and she didn't traffic in answers she wasn't certain of. What else haven't you told me? She said instead. A long pause. He set down his plate with the deliberation of a man choosing his words with the same care he might choose a route through hostile territory. My father had a partner on the Meridian project, he said. Not a colleague, a partner. Someone he was working with to try to get the evidence out. Someone inside Viridian who had access to the primary server architecture and was going to help him route the documentation to a safe endpoint. What happened to the partner? I don't know. I have a name, but no trail. The name is in the letters. The last one. I didn't show you the last letter. Isla went very still. Why not? He reached into his jacket and placed an envelope on the table. The last one. She could see from the date that it was written 11 days before Robert Ashcroft died. She could see, even before she opened it, that it was longer than the others. The envelope was thicker, the paper inside folded twice rather than once. Because the partner's name is in it, he said, and I needed to know what you'd found on your own before I showed you what he wrote. You've been sequencing what you show me. I've been careful. That's a kind word for it. She picked up the envelope. Are you going to tell me what's in it, or do you want to watch my face while I read it? He said nothing. She opened the letter. Robert Ashcroft's handwriting in the last letter was different from the earlier ones, like tighter, more compressed, the letters barely separated, the pressure on the page deep enough that she could feel the indentations through the back of the paper. A man writing fast in the dark. She read the first 2 paragraphs and held her expression together with the specific effort of someone who'd had years of practice holding their expression together in rooms where showing a reaction was a vulnerability. The partner's name was in the 4th paragraph. The only person inside Viridian who saw the full scope of what Meridian could do, and who understood why it had to be stopped, was a man who came to us laterally through a consulting arrangement that the primary architect brokered without proper documentation. He was not an employee. He had no official record inside the project. That was at the time what made him so useful. Now I understand it also made him impossible to protect. His name is Nathan Mercer. He runs a small analytics firm in Connecticut. If you are reading this, and if Nathan is still alive, he will have spent the years since carrying something he cannot put down and cannot survive putting down. Find him, not to judge him. Find him because he saw what I saw, and he is the only other living witness who can confirm it. Isla put the letter on the table. She didn't put it down hard. She placed it with the specific care of someone who understood that what she did with her hands in the next 10 seconds would tell this man more about her than anything she'd said in 17 days. The room was very quiet. "You knew," she said. Her voice came out even. She was distantly proud of that. "I suspected, after the first week of your work, when you started finding his name in the documents, I suspected you'd find the connection eventually. And you didn't tell me. I needed to know if the connection was real before I said anything. You needed to know if I'd hide it." She looked at him directly. "You were testing me." He didn't deny it. That was, she thought, the most honest thing he'd done since she arrived. "My father," she said, and stopped. She picked up the letter again and read the last paragraph a second time, as if the words might have rearranged themselves into something survivable, and they hadn't. "My father was the partner." Yes. He was inside the Meridian Project. As a consultant, no formal record. And when your father was killed, he was approached and told to stay silent, apparently. And he did. Vincent was quiet. "And he did," she said again, and this time it wasn't a question. She stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked at the tree line and breathed through the specific nausea of a belief system reorganizing itself under duress. She'd built her understanding of her father across 28 years. His patience, his precision, the way he'd taught her to read rooms and recognize liars, the quiet pride he'd taken in her work at Hargrove. All of it sat in her chest now with a different weight than it had an hour ago. "He spent the rest of his life collecting evidence," she said, half to herself, remembering what Robert had written in the earlier letters. "He was trying to find a way out that didn't get us killed. That's what my father believed. Your father is dead." She turned around. "And mine spent 20 years protecting a lie that got him killed. Isla, don't." She held up one hand. "Just don't say something careful right now. I'll hear it as a calculation and it'll make things worse." He stopped. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd opened the door of Mercer Hall and found him on the steps, his face held something that wasn't controlled. It wasn't pity. It was closer to recognition. The expression of a man who knew what it felt like to have the dead rearrange themselves into something unrecognizable. He said nothing. That was the right call. She went back to the table and sat down and pulled the legal pad toward her and wrote her father's name at the top of a new page. Then she wrote, underneath it, everything she now knew. Not everything she felt. She'd earned the right to feel it later, in private, where it didn't compromise anything, just the facts. What Robert had written, what the documents showed, what the timeline implied. At the bottom of the page she wrote, "Where is the evidence he collected?" Then she underlined it twice. "There's something else," Vincent said. She looked up. "The encrypted vault." He sat down across from her. "I told you about it on the first night, the passive redundancy nodes from the Viridian server architecture. I've had my technical people trying to access the primary node for 3 years. They can get to the interface, but the authentication layer is unlike anything they've seen. It's not a password architecture. It's biometric, but not fingerprint or retinal. It's vocal, voice authenticated. That's unusual for that era of server architecture. It was custom built by the primary architect of the Meridian project. He designed the vault himself and then made the authentication something that couldn't be tortured out of anyone." Isla thought about that. If he made the authentication vocal, then he chose a specific voice. Whose? Vincent looked at her with the particular stillness of a man delivering a weight he's been carrying for a long time. "We don't know," he said. "But the secondary authentication layer, there are 2, sequential. The secondary one is linked to a biometric profile that was registered under a user ID associated with a Mercer Analytics consulting account from 22 years ago." The room went very quiet. You think the vault requires my father's voice, she said. I think it requires a voice from your father's account, and your father has been dead for 4 years. She understood then, the full shape of it, the reason he'd come to Mercer Hall specifically, the reason it had to be her, not just her expertise, not just her analytical skills, the reason, underneath all of it. You think it'll accept mine, she said. I think it's possible. Voice authentication systems from that era used harmonic profile matching, not exact waveform replication. Family members, particularly direct descendants, often share enough harmonic overlap to trigger a match if the system was calibrated with any margin. Or it won't work and we've come this far for nothing. Or it won't work, he agreed, but I think it will. She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the tree line stood unchanged in the dark, indifferent and solid. She thought about her father in a parking structure in White Plains, looking at a man who was already counting his remaining days. She thought about 20 years of careful, guilty silence, dressed up as ordinary life. She thought about the letter opener on the hall table and the night she'd decided to open the door. "Where's the vault?" she said. "New Jersey, the same logistics company address from the defunct registration. The building is still standing. We've had eyes on it for a year." "When do we go?" "When you're ready." She picked up her pen. "I need to finish reading the logs. I need to map the full network before we touch that vault, because if someone's been watching this investigation, they'll be watching for a move on that location, and we need to know who's watching before we walk into range." She started writing. "Give me 48 hours. "You have them." She worked through the night and into the following day, and on the 41st hour, she found the thread she'd been missing, buried in the raw network log, a relay signature that matched nothing in any commercial database but matched, with a precision that made her scalp tighten, the proprietary infrastructure of a firm called Castellan Group. Private intelligence, private security. Currently listed as a subsidiary of Proximate Technologies, the same conglomerate that had acquired Viridian Solutions 19 years ago. The same organization that had employed the man Robert Ashcroft had been afraid to name in his letters. She pulled the public records on Proximate Technologies' current ownership and found, after 3 corporate veils, a single name at the top of the structure. She wrote it on her legal pad. Then she looked at the name for a long time. Martin Gale, 61 years old, founder of 2 technology firms and one of the most publicly celebrated figures in American defense innovation, the kind of man who appeared at Senate hearings as an expert witness, whose philanthropic foundation had endowed 3 university research centers, whose face appeared on the cover of business magazines with cover lines about vision and legacy and the future of national security. A man whose name appeared nowhere in any of the Meridian documentation. Nowhere except one place. A single line in the 7th letter, where Robert Ashcroft had written, "He goes by different names in different rooms, and in none of those rooms does he appear to be the architect of anything. That is precisely why no one will believe it when the proof arrives." Isla picked up the phone, the secure line Vincent had set up for her, and called him. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Martin Gale," she said. A silence. Then, "Where did you find him?" "Everywhere," she said. "He's been in the infrastructure the whole time. The Castellan Group is his. The probe on our network 3 weeks ago came from his infrastructure. He's been watching this investigation since before I arrived, which means he had advance notice that it was being reopened, which means you have a problem inside your own organization that is more serious than an anomalous ping." Another silence, longer this time. Isla. His voice, on the line, had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not alarm, but its compressed, disciplined cousin. "I need you to lock down your workspace. Don't send anything through the network. Write nothing digital." "Why?" "Because Martin Gale is not just the man who had my father killed," he said. "He is currently the lead contractor on 3 active federal intelligence programs, which means he has access to capabilities that make our network security academic. If he knows you found his name," a sound in the corridor outside her workspace, not Craw's footsteps. Wrong weight, wrong cadence. Isla set the phone down without ending the call and reached across the desk for the nearest hard object, which was the carafe of water, and stood up from the chair and put her back to the wall beside the door. In the same motion, the same instinct that had put her back against the wall of the staircase at Mercer Hall on a night that now felt like it belonged to a different woman. The door opened. The man who came through it was not one of Vincent's people. She'd spent 17 days memorizing Vincent's people, their height, their gait, the particular way each of them held their shoulders, and this man was none of them. He was compact and unhurried, and his eyes went to the desk before they went to the wall, which told her he was looking for the work before he was looking for her, which meant his primary objective was the carafe connected with the side of his head before he finished clearing the doorframe. Not hard enough to drop him, hard enough to matter. He turned into the impact rather than away from it, which told her he'd been hit before and knew how to absorb it. And then his hand was on her wrist, and the carafe was on the floor, and they were pressed against the wall of the workspace in a configuration that was neither a fight nor its absence, but the compressed moment between the two. "Stop," he said. Not a shout, a flat instruction. She stopped because the alternative was getting her wrist broken, and she needed her wrist. He was holding her against the wall with one forearm across her collarbone and his other hand locked around her right wrist, and his face was about 14 inches from hers. And the thing she noticed, the thing she filed even in the compressed urgency of the moment, was that he wasn't breathing hard. He'd come through the door, taken a carafe to the temple, and contained her in 4 seconds without elevating his respiration at all. That was training of a specific and expensive kind. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "That's what the last man said." The last man was Pruitt's contractor. "I'm not." He held her gaze. "My name is Declan Marsh. I work for Castellan Group." The name hit her like cold water. She didn't let it show. "Then you work for Martin Gale," she said. Something moved across his face. Not denial. Something more complicated. "I work for Castellan Group," he said again, with a deliberateness that underlined the distinction. "Let go of my wrist." He did. He stepped back. He kept his hands visible, which was either genuine or a very practiced simulation of genuine, and she had enough experience reading people to know she couldn't tell which from this distance. The phone was still on the desk, the line to Vincent still open. She could hear nothing from the other end, which meant Vincent had either heard enough or the line had been cut, and she didn't know which. "How did you get into this building?" she said. The same way information about this building got to Castellan's network, from inside Ashcroft's organization. He said it without satisfaction, just information. "There's a man on Vincent Ashcroft's security detail named Reeves. He's been on Castellan's payroll for 14 months. Reeves. She didn't know the name, but she could picture the man. Quiet, mid-40s, worked the perimeter rotation. She'd seen him twice in the corridor and registered him as furniture. That was her mistake. He flagged your name the week you arrived. Flagged the reopened investigation. Flagged the network access patterns." Marsh reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and she went rigid, and he slowed the motion deliberately and produced not a weapon, but a drive. Small, matte, black, the size of a thumb. He set it on the desk between them. "That's why I'm here. Not to take your work. To give you something." She looked at the drive and didn't touch it. "Why?" "Because Martin Gale ordered the termination of this investigation 6 days ago, not the legal kind." He held her gaze. "You have somewhere between 12 and 18 hours before the order gets executed. I've been running Castellan's internal network for 4 years, and I've seen 7 termination orders. This is the first one I've broken protocol on." "Why?"
Septième day.
He was quiet for a moment, then, "Because the last termination order Gale issued was for a woman in Alexandria who'd spent 3 years building a case against him. She had 2 daughters. The order specified no witnesses." His voice was flat the way voices went flat when the emotion in them had been compressed past a certain point. "I executed that order because I didn't know what the file said until it was done. I've known what's in Martin Gale's files for 4 years, and I have been complicit. That word doesn't cover it, but it's the one available." He nodded toward the drive. "That covers it." Isla looked at him for a long time. The workspace was very quiet. Somewhere in the building she could hear footsteps. Vincent's people, probably, responding to something, and she had approximately 90 seconds before this room filled with people who would shoot Declan Marsh before he finished explaining himself. She picked up the drive. "What's on it?" she said. Gale's internal communications regarding the Meridian acquisition, 19 years of financial records for the shell structures he used to fund the cover-up, and a video file. He paused. The parking structure, Westchester County. 19 years ago. The air went out of the room. "There's footage," she said. Castellan's predecessor firm handled the operation. They documented it. Gale kept the documentation because that's what men like him do. They keep the proof of their worst acts as insurance, to hold over the people who carried out the orders. 3 of those people are still in his organization. The footage is their leash. Marsh glanced at the door. "Your window is closing." She closed her fist around the drive. The door opened and Craw came through it fast with 2 other men behind him and his hand already moving, and Isla said, "Stop," in a voice that came out with enough force that all 3 men actually stopped. "He's not a threat," she said. "Get Vincent." Vincent arrived in 40 seconds, which meant he'd been close, which meant the open phone line had done its job. He took in the room. The carafe on the floor, the water spreading across the concrete, Marsh standing with his hands visible, Isla with her fists closed, and said nothing for a moment that lasted longer than its actual duration. Then he looked at Marsh. "Declan." Marsh looked back. "Vincent." They knew each other. The specific quality of that silence was not the silence of strangers. Isla watched it and filed it and said nothing. "How long?" Vincent said. "Castellan, 4 years. Before that, 2 years independent. Before that," Marsh stopped. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." "I know." Marsh looked at the drive in Isla's hand. "There's a termination order on her, 12 hours, maybe less, and Reeves needs to be addressed before he reports that I made contact." Vincent turned to Craw and said 3 words, and Craw left with both men behind him, and the 3 of them were alone. Isla opened her hand and held the drive out toward Vincent. He looked at it and then at her. "He says there's footage from the parking structure," she said. "Westchester County." Vincent's face did something she hadn't seen it do before. It didn't break. It was not the face of a man who broke, but something behind his eyes shifted with the particular heaviness of a weight that had been carried so long it had fused with the bone. "Play it," he said. She plugged the drive into the terminal. It took 40 seconds to decrypt. The drive had its own embedded key, which meant Marsh had prepared this in advance, had planned the handoff, which meant he'd been working toward this moment for longer than tonight. She filed that. She opened the video file. The footage was from a fixed-position camera, low resolution by current standards, but sharp enough, time-stamped from 19 years ago at 11:47 p.m. The parking structure was concrete and low-lit, the kind that existed in the anonymous middle distance of infrastructure. Robert Ashcroft's car was visible in the frame, a dark sedan parked on the second level. He was visible too, standing beside the driver's door, and he was talking to someone. The someone was off camera for the first 40 seconds. Then the angle shifted. A second camera, a different position, and the second feed showed the full scene. 3 men, Robert Ashcroft and 2 others. One of the others was in a suit. The other was Declan Marsh, 19 years younger, standing at the edge of the frame with his back to the camera in a posture that said he was there to observe rather than participate. The man in the suit was talking. The footage had no audio. Isla could see his mouth moving, could see Robert's face, which was the face of a man who'd known this was coming and had arrived anyway because there are certain appointments you keep even when you know the outcome. The man in the suit produced something from his jacket, small, medical-looking. Vincent made a sound. Just one. Low and involuntary, and then immediately suppressed. And Isla did not look at him because looking at him in this moment would have been a violation of something she didn't have a word for. The footage ran for 4 more minutes. She stopped it before the end. "The man in the suit," she said. Her voice was steady. She was using all of it to keep it steady. "That's Gale." "Yes," Marsh said. "This footage has been in Castellan's archive for 19 years. In an encrypted partition that only Gale and 2 senior directors could access. I spent 14 months building a ghost key for that partition." Vincent was standing behind her, and she could feel the quality of his stillness, the specific stillness of a man holding himself together by the sheer structural integrity of his own will. She turned off the monitor. "The termination order," she said to Marsh. 12 hours. Maybe less. Gale's been accelerating his timeline since the network probe came back with evidence of active investigation. He knows someone is close. Does he know what we have? Not yet. He knows the investigation was reopened. He doesn't know about the letters, the vault, or your identity connection. Marsh paused. He will within 24 hours if Reeves reports tonight's contact. Then we move before he does, Isla said. The vault, Vincent said. He'd moved to the window. His voice was controlled again, the temperature back down, the machinery running. She could almost hear the recalibration happening in real time. We go to New Jersey tonight. We're not ready, she said. I haven't finished mapping the... We don't have the time you needed. She turned to face him. He was looking at the window, not at her, and his jaw was set in a way that made her think of the footage and what it had done to his face and what it had cost him to put his face back in order. If we go in without a complete network map, we go in blind, she said. If the vault authentication doesn't work on the first attempt, the system will lock, and we'll have burned the only access point we have. If we wait, Gale moves and we lose everything. I need 8 hours. You have 6. She sat down at the terminal and started working. She didn't look at Marsh, and she didn't look at Vincent, and she didn't think about the footage or her father or the weight of what 19 years of buried truth actually looked like when you watched it happen in 47 seconds of low-resolution video. She thought about network topology and harmonic authentication protocols and the specific degradation pattern of a passive redundancy node that had been dormant for nearly 2 decades. She worked for 6 hours, and at the end of them she had what she needed, and her hands were not shaking, and she was very proud of that. The drive to New Jersey took 90 minutes. 3 vehicles, different routes for the first 40 minutes, converging at a staging point 12 blocks from the target address. Craw was driving her vehicle. Marsh was in the rear seat. Vincent was in the lead vehicle, and she could see the back of his head through the windshield of the car ahead of them, unmoving, the posture of a man who had decided something and was done deciding it. The building was exactly as the documents described, industrial, windowless, the kind of structure that existed to not be looked at, a logistics company signage that was 20 years out of date. The paint faded to something barely legible. The surrounding blocks were warehousing and light manufacturing, quiet at 4 in the morning. The streets lit by the orange half-life of sodium vapor lights that turned everything the color of an old photograph. They went in through the rear. Marsh had the access codes for the building's security system, another 14 months of patient intelligence work. And the internal layout matched the schematics Isla had reconstructed from the network topology. The node room was on the sub-level, accessible by a staircase at the building's center, and the air going down the stairs was the particular cold of a space that had been climate-controlled for 2 decades without ever being entered. The node room was smaller than she'd imagined. 6 server racks, most of them dark, one of them showing a faint amber indicator light that meant it was still drawing power through a connection she'd traced back to a utility account registered to a company that no longer existed. The vault interface was at the far wall, a terminal, standalone, connected to nothing external, a closed system that had been waiting in this room for 19 years for someone to come and ask it the right question. Isla stood in front of it and looked at it for a moment. Vincent stood behind her and slightly to her left. Marsh was at the door. The authentication sequence, she said. Do you know what the prompt will be? No. Vincent's voice was quiet in the small room. My father's letters mentioned that the prompt would be something that only the right person would know how to answer. He designed it that way. Not a phrase I could give to someone, a phrase that had to come from memory. Then we don't know what it'll ask. No. She looked at the terminal. The screen was dark. She pressed the power key and it came alive, not with a login prompt, not with a system interface, but with a single text field and a cursor, and above it, a sentence in plain type. Say the thing you said the last time you were happy before you understood what the world was. Isla read it twice. The room was very quiet. She thought about her father. She thought about a specific afternoon. She was 6 years old, maybe 7, and they were in the backyard of the house before the estate. The small house in Fairfield that they'd lived in before the money from Mercer Analytics started coming in. Her father was pushing her on a rope swing he'd tied to the maple tree himself, and she was laughing, and at the peak of each arc she could see over the fence to the neighbor's yard, and the neighbor's dog was barking at the swing in outrage, and she'd thought this was the funniest thing in the world, and her father had said from behind her, in the voice he only used when he thought no one was listening, "This is exactly enough." She leaned toward the terminal's microphone. "This is exactly enough," she said. The system processed for 3 seconds. Then the amber light on the server rack changed to green and a directory opened on the terminal screen. Not the full vault, not yet, one more layer. And the second prompt appeared. Now the secondary authentication. Voice profile. Mercer Analytics Consulting Account. User N. Speak any 4 words. She breathed. "I know you tried," she said. 4 words over, but the system was processing, and then it stopped, and the screen held, and she understood with a cold that had nothing to do with the room's climate control that 4 words meant 4 words, and she'd given it 6, and she needed to... "Start over," Marsh said from the door. Quietly. She looked at the screen. There was a reset prompt in the lower corner. She pressed it. The second prompt reappeared. She thought about what her father would have said. 4 words, his voice, his patterns, the way he spoke when he was being careful, when he was being precise. He didn't use contractions when he was precise. He said things complete. "Tell me the truth," she said. 4 words. His 4 words. The thing he'd said to her at Hargrove when she'd called him from the parking lot after the project got classified above her clearance, and she'd been let go and she was trying to explain it to him, and he'd said just that, across the phone line. "Tell me the truth." Because he always needed to hear the shape of a problem before he could help solve it. Because that was who he was. At the base of him. Under the guilt and the silence and the 2 decades of damaged choices. The screen held for 2 seconds. Then the vault opened. The directory was vast. More than she'd expected. More than the network topology had suggested. Files sorted by date across 19 years. The earliest ones in formats that required legacy protocols to read, the later ones more standard. At the top of the directory pinned was a single file named with the date of Robert Ashcroft's death and the label Primary. She opened it. It was a recorded confession. Audio and video, dated 11 days before Robert died, the recording quality better than the parking structure footage. Deliberate, prepared. A man who had set up a camera and sat in front of it with the specific intention of being understood. Robert Ashcroft on screen was a version of the man she'd been learning to know through his letters. The handwriting made physical, the voice underneath the words. He looked tired but not beaten. He looked like a man who had decided something and was at peace with the decision, even though the decision was the last one he was going to make. He named Martin Gale. He named the Meridian Project. He described the architecture of the software. What it could do, what Gale intended to do with it, the specific federal programs it would be positioned to infiltrate once Gale controlled the acquisition. He described the shell companies and the financial structures. He described his own attempts to go to federal authorities and the way those attempts had been shut down. He described Nathan Mercer, with care and without judgment, as a man who had been placed in an impossible position and had made the human choice rather than the heroic one. He described the vault and its authentication and why he'd designed the secondary layer to accept a Mercer Analytics voice profile, because Nathan had been the only person inside the project who Robert had trusted completely, and if Nathan was alive when the vault was found, Robert wanted him to be the one to open it, and if Nathan was not alive, then whoever opened it instead would understand from that fact alone what the cost of this truth had been. He spoke for 41 minutes. At the end, he looked directly at the camera for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "If you're Vincent, I'm sorry I couldn't finish this for you. If you're someone else, I'm grateful you came. Either way, don't let Gale keep it." The file ended. Isla sat back in the chair that someone had placed in front of the terminal years ago for a user who never came, and the room was completely silent, and she did not look at Vincent because she was not ready to see his face, and he was not ready to be seen. She looked at the directory instead, 19 years of her father's parallel life, the one he'd run underneath the ordinary one, The evidence he'd been collecting piece by piece through methods she hadn't yet examined, in the long, slow process of trying to redeem a moment that lasted less than a night and cost everything that followed it. She started copying files to the drive Marsh handed her without being asked. She was halfway through the directory when her phone, the satellite unit, the secure line, vibrated with a message from a number she didn't recognize. She read it once, then again. Then she handed it to Vincent without speaking because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate to the text on the screen, which read, "Your mother and brother have been moved from the compound. This is not our action." Reeves. Not a warning from an ally. A message from the man who had been feeding their location to Castellan Group for 14 months, who was now either trying to buy himself survival with intelligence or who had been turned in the last 6 hours by something she didn't yet understand. Either way, the message meant one thing clearly and without ambiguity. Gale hadn't waited for his 12-hour window. Gale had moved already, and he'd moved on the one variable that Isla had extracted as a condition of her agreement on the steps of Mercer Hall, the people she was doing this to protect. Vincent read the message. He looked at it for a long time without his face doing anything. Then he looked at her. "We go," he said. "The files, take what you have." She pulled the drive. 40% of the directory. Not enough. Enough of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones. And she didn't know yet which was which because she hadn't had time to sort it, and now she wasn't going to get the time. She followed him up the stairs and through the building and back into the 4 in the morning New Jersey air, and the vehicles were where they'd left them, and Craw was on the phone, and the expression on Craw's face when he looked at Vincent was the expression she'd learned over 17 days, meant the situation had changed in a way that couldn't be recovered with planning. "They hit the compound 40 minutes ago," Craw said. 6 vehicles. Our people held the perimeter, but—" He stopped. "But," Vincent said. "Your mother and brother got out," Craw said to Isla. She felt the specific geography of that sentence, what it told her by what it didn't say next. "They're secure at a secondary location, but Gale's people didn't come for them." "What did they come for?" she said. Craw looked at Vincent. "They came for the letters." The letters. In the safe. In the office that sat at the center of the compound that Gale had just hit, and the safe that Isla had watched Vincent open 14 days ago, and the 22 letters from a dead man to whoever came after him, the only physical evidence of Robert Ashcroft's intent and knowledge that existed outside of the vault they were standing 2 blocks away from. "The safe," she said. "They cut it," Craw said. "Took everything inside." The night air was cold, and the sodium lights made everything look ancient, and she stood on a New Jersey sidewalk at 4:30 in the morning with a drive that was 40% full, and the footage that Marsh had given her, and the memory of 41 minutes of recorded confession. And she understood with the absolute clarity of a woman whose entire analytical framework had just been reduced to its essential skeleton that they had the vault's contents, and Gale had the letters, and neither of them had everything, and the next move was the only move that mattered. Vincent stood beside her. He was looking at nothing in particular. The middle distance, the orange-lit street, the shape of a situation that had just reorganized itself entirely. His hands were still. His face was still. But she could feel, in the particular quality of the air around him, that something had shifted below the controlled surface. That the man who had spent 19 years building toward this moment was now standing at the edge of a decision that would define whether those years had meant anything. "He has the letters," Vincent said. Quiet. Flat. "We have the recording," she said, "and the financial files, and the footage. He has the letters, which means he has my father's handwriting placing Nathan at the center of the cover-up, which means—" He stopped. She finished it. "Which means if this goes to any official channel now, the first thing Gale's lawyers do is use the letters to make Nathan the story instead of Gale." She could hear her own voice saying it and feel simultaneously the shape of what it meant, that her father's partial guilt, carefully extracted from context, could be weaponized to muddy every piece of clean evidence they'd spent 3 weeks building. He's not going to use the letters to hide. He's going to use them to redirect. Yes. We can't let this go to a standard federal channel. No? Then what? She said. And the question was real, not rhetorical, not despairing, But the genuine question of a woman who had just run the analysis and found the output required something she hadn't yet identified. Vincent looked at her. In the sodium orange light, his face was all shadow and structure, and the specific expression of a man who had spent a long time being the most dangerous thing in any room he walked into and had just decided to be that thing again, but differently. Not for the first time with the old objectives, with new ones. "There's a federal prosecutor in the Southern District," he said. "She's been building a case against Gale's defense contracts for 2 years through a completely separate investigation. Procurement fraud, nothing to do with Meridian. She doesn't know what she's adjacent to. But if we bring her what we have from the vault and make the introduction before Gale can position his narrative, the letters become corroborating evidence of a pattern rather than the centerpiece of an accusation. You've been sitting on a contact inside the Southern District. I've been sitting on a lot of things. That," she said, "is something we are going to discuss at length when this is over." "Yes," he said, "we are." She looked at the drive in her hand. 40%. The recording. The footage Marsh had given her. The financial shell documentation. Not everything, but enough. Enough to build the frame that the letters, once extracted from Gale's narrative control, could fill. But there was one thing she still needed. One piece that the vault's directory had contained and that she hadn't reached before Craw's call had ended the copy. A file dated 6 months before Robert Ashcroft's death, labeled in the directory simply N, his own words, her father's voice. In the vault, recorded before anyone died, before the weight of it had crushed the ordinary life into its final shape. Her father, speaking in his own words about what he'd seen and what he'd done and why, in the specific voice of a man who had not yet finished trying. She'd left it in the vault. 40% through the directory, and she'd left it there. She turned back toward the building. "Isla," Vincent's voice. "The directory's still open," she said. 5 minutes. "We don't have—" 5 minutes, she said, and she was already moving, back through the rear entrance and down the stairs and into the cold of the node room. And the terminal was still active, and she plugged the drive back in and navigated to the file and started the transfer and watched the progress bar move across the screen with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that were going to either save or end everything. And when it hit 100%, she pulled the drive and stood up, and in the doorway of the node room, blocking the exit, was a man she had never seen before, with a Castellan group badge clipped to his jacket and a weapon in his hand, and behind him were 2 more. And he looked at her with the expression of someone who had been told to retrieve a specific item and had found the item exactly where it was supposed to be. "The drive," he said. "Set it on the floor and step back." She looked at the drive in her hand, then at him. "No," she said, and the word came out of a place in her that she hadn't known existed until approximately 17 days ago, in the basement of a Connecticut estate with a letter opener in her hand, the place where fear ran out of room and something harder moved in to fill the space. She did not step back. The man with the Castellan badge took 1 step into the room. Isla threw the drive. Not at him. Past him. A hard, flat throw to the left toward the gap between the first server rack and the wall, a space about 8 inches wide and dark enough that a small, matte black object would take 30 seconds to find even if you knew exactly where it landed. The man's eyes tracked it involuntarily. That was 1 second. She used the second to move right instead of back, toward the near server rack, putting steel between herself and the weapon. And she was behind it before he recalibrated, and by then the geometry of the room had changed enough that shooting her meant shooting through equipment that he'd been sent here to preserve. "Don't!" the second man said from the door. To the first man. Not to her. The first man didn't shoot. She put her back against the server rack and felt the hum of it through her shoulder blades. 19 years of dormant machinery suddenly relevant. And looked at the 3 men arranged in the doorway and calculated the distance to the drive and the distance to the stairs and found both numbers insufficient. Then Vincent came through the doorway behind them. He came through it the way he'd come up the steps of Mercer Hall, without announcement, without hurry, with the specific quality of a man for whom the question of whether to enter a room had already been resolved before he reached it. He had Craw on his left and Marsh on his right and 2 more people she didn't know behind them, and the three Castellan men processed the new geometry of the room in the half-second it took to understand they were now the smaller number. The first man lowered his weapon. Slowly. The way men lowered weapons when they were doing math and didn't like the answer. "The drive," Vincent said. To Isla. She moved to the gap between the rack and the wall and crouched and found it in 4 seconds by feel, the matte surface cold against her palm. She stood up and looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the room hadn't already said. Marsh zip-tied the 3 Castellan men to the server racks with the practiced efficiency of someone who kept zip ties for exactly this contingency. The tallest one, the one who'd spoken first, the one who'd told her to set the drive on the floor, looked at Marsh with an expression that was more resignation than anger. "He'll know within the hour," the man said. "He already knows," Marsh said. "That's why we're moving now." They were back in the vehicles in 4 minutes. The drive was in Isla's jacket pocket, and she kept her hand on it through the pocket fabric, not because she thought it would go anywhere, but because the physical contact of it helped her think, and she needed to think clearly and fast, and without the luxury of the kind of time that clear thinking normally required. In the vehicle, moving, Vincent on her left, Marsh on her right, Craw driving without being told where. He knew, apparently, the direction of the next thing, which meant Vincent had given instructions she hadn't heard. She pulled out the satellite unit and accessed the partial files she'd transferred before the Castellan team arrived. "The federal prosecutor," she said. "How fast can you get her on a secure line?" "I have a contact method. It'll take 2 hours to establish the channel safely." "We don't have 2 hours." "I know." "Then unsafely." He looked at her. "An unsecured contact to a sitting federal prosecutor at 5 in the morning puts her at risk." Gale already moved on the compound. He already has the letters. The safe assumption is that his next move is either to destroy what we have or to position his version of events somewhere that makes ours inadmissible. She held his gaze. "Every hour we spend on secure channels is an hour he spends building a wall we can't climb." Vincent was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he took the satellite unit from her and dialed a number from memory. It rang 4 times. Then a woman's voice, alert in a way that said she hadn't been sleeping even at 5 in the morning. "This line isn't Catherine," Vincent's voice. "It's Ashcroft. Don't say my name on this line. I have evidence material to a case you've been building for 2 years. And I have a witness, and I have approximately 6 hours before the subject of that case uses his federal contractor access to make both of those things disappear. I need 40 minutes of your time and a location that isn't your office." A silence. Then, "How did you get this number?" "The same way I get everything. Are you listening or not?" Another silence, shorter. "There's a parking structure on Varick Street, level 3. 1 hour." The line went dead. Varick Street was 40 minutes from their current position. Craw already knew and didn't need to be told, which meant either Vincent had anticipated this call or Craw had been listening, and she filed that for later along with the other 17 things she was filing for later and turned to the window and watched the New Jersey industrial corridor give way to the approach of the Holland Tunnel and thought about her father's voice in that vault and what it had cost him to put it there. Catherine Voss was already on level 3 when they arrived. She was 40-something, compact, dressed in civilian clothes that did nothing to disguise the bearing of a woman who spent her professional life in federal courtrooms, and she looked at Vincent with the particular expression of someone who had decided to trust a calculation before she'd finished running it. She looked at Isla with something more careful. "Who is she?" Voss said. "The analyst who found your case's missing dimension," Vincent said. Isla put the drive on the hood of Voss's car. 41 minutes of recorded testimony from a direct witness to a murder committed 19 years ago. Complete financial documentation for the shell structures used to fund the cover-up, surveillance footage from the night of the murder, and... She took a breath. A recorded account from a secondary witness who has since died, in which he describes in specific detail the coercion used to maintain his silence. Voss looked at the drive, then at Isla. "Your secondary witness." "My father." Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the drive. "Gale has physical letters," Isla said. "Handwritten documents that establish my father's involvement in the original cover-up. He'll use them to contaminate the chain of evidence and redirect the narrative to my father's culpability if you go through standard filing channels. I'm aware of how he operates, Voss said. It was said without heat, but with the weight of 2 years behind it. What I need to know is whether what's on this drive is clean enough to survive a suppression challenge. The primary source material is 19 years old and was preserved in a closed vault system with no external network access. The chain of custody is documentable from Robert Ashcroft's creation of the vault to tonight's access. Nothing has been altered. And the footage came from Castellan Group's internal archive via a source who is prepared to testify to the circumstances of its preservation. She paused. That testimony will be complicated by the source's own history of compliance with Gale's directives, but it's documentable. Voss looked at Marsh, who was standing at the edge of the light, a position that was either strategic or habitual, or both. You're the source. Yes, Marsh said. You've been inside Castellan for 4 years. Yes. And in those 4 years, you have direct personal knowledge of everything that's on that drive and significantly more, he said. I'll give you a complete debrief. On the record. Voss looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone evaluating a very complicated gift. You understand that a complete debrief on the record means full exposure of your own actions during your time at Castellan. Yes, Marsh said. No hesitation. None. Voss put the drive in her coat pocket. I need 6 hours to review what you've given me and consult with my office. Not through standard channels. I have 2 people I trust completely. We'll file simultaneously across 3 district courts to prevent suppression in any single jurisdiction. She looked at Vincent. While I'm doing that, I need Gale contained. Not, she held up one hand, not your way. Contained in the sense that he doesn't leave the country and he doesn't destroy anything further. Can you do that without creating a separate criminal exposure problem for me to manage? Yes, Vincent said. How? He has 3 properties he uses for secure communications. I've had eyes on 2 of them for 8 months. The 3rd we identified tonight through the compound raid. His people used a relay address that traced back to a location in Westchester. If all 3 go dark simultaneously, he loses the infrastructure he needs to coordinate a destruction effort. Going dark how? Power interruptions, legitimate ones, transformer issues, grid anomalies, nothing that leaves fingerprints. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and got in her car and drove down the ramp and was gone. The parking structure was very quiet. Isla stood beside the vehicle and felt, for the first time in 18 days, the specific exhaustion of a body that had been running on something other than sleep for too long. The deep muscular ache of sustained tension finally acknowledging itself. 6 hours, she said. Yes. We need somewhere Gale's people can't reach in 6 hours. I have a location, Vincent said. Not the compound. Something Reeves didn't know about. She got in the vehicle. She didn't ask where. She trusted the calculation, which was not the same as trusting the man, but was close enough for 6 hours and a parking structure in Lower Manhattan at 5:30 in the morning. The location was a floor of a building in Tribeca that bore no exterior identification and whose elevator required a key that Vincent produced from his watch pocket. The floor was sparse, furniture that suggested utility rather than habitation, windows that looked out over the Hudson with the first gray suggestion of dawn coming off the water. Cross set up a communication station at the far end of the main room. Marsh sat in the corner with a legal pad and began writing in the methodical, exhausted way of a man who had decided to document everything and was starting immediately. Isla sat at the window. Vincent brought her coffee. He set it on the ledge beside her and stood behind her looking at the water and said nothing, which was, she'd learned, his version of the most he could offer. My father's voice, she said. She wasn't talking to him specifically. In the vault. He recorded himself. I know. He said, in the file, he described what he'd seen and what he'd done. I listened to 40 seconds of it before I had to stop the transfer and run. She looked at the water. I don't know what he said. I have the file, but I haven't... She stopped. You don't have to listen to it tonight. I know. She picked up the coffee. I'm going to anyway. She put the earbuds in and opened the file on the tablet and listened to her father's voice for the first time in 4 years, and the last time she'd ever hear something new from him. And the room receded, and the Hudson outside went gray and then pale, and then something approaching gold as the morning came in over it, and she sat very still with her hands around the coffee that went cold while she listened. Nathan Mercer's voice was exactly as she remembered it. The particular cadence of a precise man, the slight hesitation before important words, the way he lowered his register when he was ashamed of something, and raised it when he was certain. He was ashamed through most of the recording. He was certain at the end. He described the night of Robert Ashcroft's murder in language that was flat and specific and devoid of the self-exculpation she'd steeled herself for. He described what he'd been asked to do and what he'd done. He described the threat that had preceded the ask, the specific and credible threat against Eleanor and Isla and an infant Daniel. And he described his decision in a single sentence that she had to replay twice. I chose them over him, and I knew what I was choosing, and I would make the same choice again, and I have spent every day since trying to make it mean something it doesn't. He described 20 years of parallel work, the evidence he'd collected, the channels he'd tried and found blocked, the documentation he'd routed to the vault through methods that used his own Mercer Analytics network access in ways that Gale's people never thought to monitor, because by the time they realized Nathan was a loose end rather than a controlled asset, Nathan had already been sick for 2 years, and they'd apparently decided a dying man was a manageable risk. He described Robert Ashcroft with the same grace Robert had used for him in the letters, which was the kind of symmetry that didn't happen in constructed narratives and only happened in life when two people had genuinely seen each other clearly. And at the end, after a pause long enough that she thought the recording had ended, he said, Isla, if this reaches you, and I designed it to reach you, I've been designing it to reach you for 6 years since you started at Hargrove, and I understood what you were building toward, and I understood that you were the only person I knew who would actually get here. I need you to know that none of what I did was about protecting myself. I know that's what it looks like. I know the shape of it is the shape of a man who saved his own family at someone else's expense and then spent 20 years rationalizing it. I'm not going to argue with the shape of it. I'm just going to tell you that the thing I was most afraid of, the whole time, was that you would find out and decide that it made me someone other than who I was to you. I don't think it should, but I understand if it does. Finish it. Whatever's in the rest of this vault, finish it. That's all I'm asking. The recording ended. Isla took the earbuds out and sat with the silence for a while, and outside the Hudson was fully gold now, and the city was waking up around it with the indifferent momentum of a place that didn't know or care what had just been resolved inside one woman in a window overlooking the water. She didn't cry. She didn't have a name for what she did instead. It wasn't grief exactly, and it wasn't relief. It was the specific feeling of a person who has been carrying a version of someone and has just received a more complete one, and the new version is heavier and more real and harder to hold, and also more worth holding. Vincent was across the room. She looked at him. He left it for me, she said. Deliberately, he knew I'd be the one. Vincent looked at her. Yes. He knew because he knew what I did at Hargrove. He was watching my career. She set the tablet down. He was proud of me, and he was terrified of me simultaneously. That sounds about right, Vincent said. Something in his voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. My father was the same way about me. The last time I spoke to him, 2 days before he died, he told me to get out of the business I'd built. He said it was going to cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. A pause. I told him I didn't know what that meant. Do you know now? He looked at the window. I think so. At 9:47 in the morning, Catherine Voss called the secure line. Her voice had the particular compressed energy of a woman who had been working for 4 hours without stopping and had found what she was looking for. The primary recording is clean, she said. The financial documentation is going to take longer to process, but the initial review establishes the shell structure clearly enough to support a filing. I need 2 more hours. You have them, Vincent said. Gale knows something is happening. His legal team made 3 calls to my office's main line this morning. Phishing calls. Nothing specific, but he's positioned. His communications infrastructure goes dark in 40 minutes. Vincent said. The Westchester property first, then the others. I want to be clear that I have no knowledge of how that happens. You don't, Vincent said. You have knowledge that a grid anomaly was reported in 3 separate districts this morning. That's all. That's all, Voss repeated. 2 hours. Don't move. They didn't move. The 2 hours were the longest Isla had sat still since the night at Mercer Hall. And the stillness had a different quality than exhaustion. It was the stillness of a mechanism wound to its limit, waiting for the moment when the tension released into motion. Craw confirmed the communications blackouts at 10:15. 3 properties, 3 grid anomalies, no fingerprints. Gail's network went dark in the window between Voss's call and her next one, which came at 11:52. We're filing in the next 20 minutes, Voss said. Simultaneous warrants across Southern District, Northern District, and the District of Connecticut. Asset freezes as well. I have a judge who owes me a very old favor, and I'm using it today. A pause. There's something else. The letters. Gail has them, Isla said. Had them. His Westchester property was one of the locations subject to a warrant executed this morning in connection with a separate matter, the procurement fraud case I've been building. The letters were in the property when federal agents executed the warrant. They're now in federal custody. Another pause. They'll be part of the evidentiary record, which means they'll be evaluated in context rather than in isolation. Isla closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them. Nathan Mercer's name will be in the public record, she said. Yes, but Robert Ashcroft's recording provides the context. Your father's own testimony provides the context. The picture that emerges is complicated, Isla said. Yes, complicated is accurate. Voss's voice was careful, but not unkind. Not a villain, not a hero. A man who made a decision and spent 20 years trying to account for it. Juries understand that. More importantly, the press understands that. And the press is going to matter in the next 72 hours more than the jury. The warrants executed at 12:17 p.m. Isla knew because Craw had contacts who would know, and Craw said simply, "It's moving," in the flat voice of a man reporting weather. And Vincent said nothing, and the room held the specific quality of a silence in which something very large had just begun to fall. At 2 p.m., Martin Gale's legal team issued a statement through a public relations firm denying all allegations and describing the warrants as a politically motivated action by a federal office with a documented history of overreach. The statement was precise and expensive and completely useless, which Isla recognized because she'd spent 6 years reading documents produced by people who were trying to control a narrative they'd already lost. At 2:40, federal agents executed an arrest warrant at Gale's Manhattan residence. She didn't watch the news coverage. She heard it through the open laptop Craw had positioned on the communications table, the audio carrying across the room in fragments, correspondent's voice, the specific language of breaking news, a name repeated with the rising inflection of something that had just become irrevocable. She was standing at the window when Vincent came to stand beside her. Outside, the city moved with its ordinary velocity, unaware and ongoing. The Hudson caught the afternoon light and held it briefly before releasing it into the general movement of water heading south. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "The legal process is going to take months. His lawyers are competent, and they'll fight everything. But the infrastructure is gone." "Yes." "And the footage exists in federal custody now." "Yes." She turned from the window. "I need to see my mother." "I know, we can move in the next hour." She looked at him. In the afternoon light of the Tribeca floor, he looked the way she suspected he always looked when the operational pressure dropped far enough to reveal the person underneath. Tired, specifically, in a way that had accumulated over years rather than days. The tiredness of a man who had built something formidable in the service of a wound and was now standing on the other side of it, trying to figure out what the formidable thing was for. "The Ashcroft name," she said. "It'll be in the coverage." "Yes." "Everything you've built was built on a foundation that was already compromised," he said. "I knew that. I built it anyway because I needed the reach. The reach is what got us here." He looked at the window. "What it costs going forward is a separate accounting." She thought about what Voss had said about the press and the next 72 hours. And she thought about what Vincent's organization looked like in a federal spotlight. And she thought about the particular irony of a man who had spent 19 years building an empire, capable of doing what law couldn't do, and had now handed the result to the law and would spend the next year explaining the empire to people who didn't have the context to understand it. Her phone vibrated, a number she recognized as the satellite relay for the secondary location where Eleanor and Daniel had been taken. She answered. Her mother's voice was the voice she'd known her entire life, precise, contained, and underneath the precision a quality that Isla had always interpreted as strength, but now understood, with the new comprehension of the last 18 days, as something more complicated than that. The endurance of a woman who had known more than she said for longer than Isla had been equipped to understand. Your brother wants to know when you're coming, Eleanor said. An hour, maybe less. A pause. Are you all right? It was not a question Eleanor Mercer asked lightly or often. She asked it now in a voice that suggested she already knew the answer was not simple, but was asking anyway because she needed to hear Isla's voice perform the act of answering. I will be, Isla said. That's good enough. Another pause. I heard his voice, in the recording. They played it for me, the prosecutor's people. They needed me to confirm it was him. Her voice was very controlled. I confirmed it. Mom. He was trying, Eleanor said. For a very long time, he was trying. I want you to know that I know that. Isla stood at the window with the phone against her ear and the city outside doing its ordinary business beneath an ordinary sky, and she said, I know, Mom. I know he was. They left the Tribeca floor at 3:15. 3 vehicles, a route that changed once out of habit rather than necessity, because the necessity had been restructured in the last 6 hours into something legal and proceeding, and no longer dependent on Vincent Ashcroft's organizational architecture to keep it upright. She was in the rear vehicle. Marsh was in the lead. Vincent was beside her reading something on a tablet with the focused quiet of a man already moving toward the next set of problems, because men like him were always moving toward the next set of problems. Outside the window, New York moved past, the industrial blocks transitioning to residential, the specific compressed life of the city in afternoon light, everything ordinary and ongoing and indifferent to the weight of what had just shifted inside it. She was going to see her mother. Her father's voice was in her pocket on a drive the size of her thumb. Martin Gale was in federal custody in a building somewhere in Manhattan, and his lawyers were making calls, and the press was constructing the narrative with the speed and imprecision that the press always used. And somewhere in the Southern District, Catherine Voss was working through documents with 2 people she trusted completely. And somewhere in New Jersey, a vault was still open in a room no one had locked. At the intersection of 2 streets whose names she didn't catch, the lead vehicle's brake lights came on. Then Craw's voice on the radio, tight and specific. We have company. Black sedan. No plates. Been with us since the tunnel. 2 more behind it. Vincent's hand moved to the inside of his jacket. Isla looked through the rear window. 3 vehicles, precise formation, the kind that said this wasn't improvised, the kind that said someone had been waiting for them to move. Gale's people, she said. Or someone who works for Gale, Vincent said. He has layers. He's in custody. Custody doesn't end an organization. It just changes who's making the calls. The lead sedan accelerated. The 3 vehicles behind them accelerated to match. Options, she said. Vincent was already on the radio, and the instructions he gave in the next 15 seconds were the instructions of a man who had spent 19 years building the capacity for exactly this situation. Routes, positions, contacts, a geography of preparation that she was now entirely inside of and entirely dependent on. She didn't resent it. She understood it. She'd spent 6 years building her own version of the same thing in a different register. And the difference between them was mostly the instrument. The vehicle accelerated through an amber light, and she braced against the seat, and Craw said something sharp into the radio, and the 3 vehicles behind them were still matching their speed, and the city outside was moving fast now, all of it compressed into the urgent present tense of a situation that had not finished resolving despite everything that had happened in the last 9 hours. She held the drive in her jacket pocket with her right hand. Her left hand was flat on the seat, and she could feel the seam of it under her palm, and the specific sensation grounded her the way the carafe had grounded her in the node room. The weight of a real thing in a situation where everything else was moving too fast. "Vincent," she said, "I know. If they get the drive, they won't. If they do, Isla." He looked at her. His face was the face she'd been learning to read for 18 days. The controlled surface, and underneath it, the quality of a man who meant exactly what he said and said exactly what he meant. "They won't." The vehicle turned hard left, and she went into the door, and ahead of them the street opened up into a wider avenue, and she could see 2 blocks down, 2 more of Vincent's vehicles pulling out of a side street to bracket the avenue, not blocking their path but closing the space behind them. And the 3 pursuing vehicles read the geometry of it, and the formation broke, the lead sedan peeling right, the 2 behind it separating. Cross said, "We've got the avenue, 30 seconds. 30 seconds was a long time and also not long at all. She'd learned that in the last 18 days. A lot of things resolved in 30 seconds. A lot of things started. The avenue opened up ahead of them, and she watched it come and held the drive and breathed. And beside her, Vincent was utterly still with the stillness she'd identified on the first night as something other than calm. The stillness of a man who had decided the outcome and was simply waiting for the situation to catch up to the decision. The pursuing vehicles fell back, not stopped. Fell back, which was different. Which meant they were either calling for instruction or reassessing. And either way, the distance between the pursuing formation and their vehicle was opening rather than closing, and Craw said, "Clear." And she felt the specific relaxation of a danger that had retreated rather than resolved. She looked at Vincent. He looked at her. "We need to end this tonight," she said. "Whatever's left of his network, we can't keep moving targets. We need to make this stop." "I know." "Voss can't do it in time. The legal process is too slow. Whatever operational capability he has left, he'll use it in the next 12 hours before the legal walls close in." "Yes." "The Westchester property," she said. "Before the warrant team left, was there anything in it besides the letters?" Vincent was quiet for 2 seconds. "There's a communications center on the sublevel. My contact inside the warrant team confirmed it was in use as of this morning, which means it survived the grid anomaly long enough to transmit something before they lost power." "You made a call before the blackout?" "Presumably. To whoever's in those 3 vehicles, or to whoever manages whoever's in those 3 vehicles." She turned this over, the drive in her pocket, the avenue opening up ahead. The specific arithmetic of a situation in which the legal infrastructure was moving but not yet fast enough to prevent a man with 30 years of carefully maintained operational capability from deploying whatever was left of it in the window before the walls closed. "He has one move," she said, "discrediting the primary source material before it reaches the court." The recording. Robert Ashcroft's testimony. She thought, if he can establish that the vault was tampered with, that the chain of custody is contaminated, then the recording becomes challengeable. He doesn't need to destroy it. He just needs to make it questionable. And to do that, he needs access to the node room, Vincent said. Or he needs to put someone in a position to testify that the node room was accessed by parties with a motive to manipulate the contents. She looked at him. Marsh. He was inside the node room. He has Castellan history. Gale's lawyers put Marsh on the stand and build a narrative about a disgruntled operative with access and motive, and the recording goes from bulletproof to arguable. Marsh knew that when he handed us the drive. Yes, she said. He knew. She thought about Marsh in the corner of the Tribeca floor, writing in his legal pad with the exhausted, methodical calm of a man getting his affairs in order. He needs protection, she said. He's with the lead vehicle. Not operational protection, legal protection. Voss needs to lock his testimony before Gale's lawyers can construct the alternative narrative. If Marsh is a federal witness with a formal proffer agreement on the record, his credibility becomes the government's investment to protect rather than Gale's target to destroy. Vincent looked at her. Something moved in his face that she was getting better at reading. The specific expression of a man encountering an analysis that had outpaced his own. "Call Voss," he said. She was already dialing. Voss answered on the first ring. Isla laid it out in 90 seconds, the way she'd learned to lay things out for people who didn't have time for throat clearing. Voss listened without interruption, which was the sign of a person who understood that interrupting someone who was moving fast was how you made them slower. When Isla finished, Voss said, "Proffer agreement requires Marsh's consent and his attorney." "He doesn't have an attorney. He needs one in the next hour. Can you recommend one who can move that fast?" A pause. "I can make a call. Marsh needs to consent to this voluntarily and on record. I won't build a case on a witness who is pressured into testimony." "He'll consent," Isla said. "He's been moving toward this for 4 years. He just needs someone to open the door." "Get him on a phone." She switched to the radio. "Craw, put Marsh on." Marsh's voice came through 30 seconds later, static-edged from the relay. "Yeah." "Federal proffer agreement," she said. "Voss's office. Your testimony in exchange for formal witness status and protection. Yes or no?" A silence. Not hesitation, processing. "What does formal witness status do to my Castellan exposure?" "It makes your cooperation the government's asset. They protect their assets." "That's not an answer." "No," she said. "It's not. The honest answer is that your Castellan history goes on the record, and some of it is going to be ugly, and there's no version of this where that doesn't happen. What the agreement does is give you the structure to tell the full story in the right sequence to the right people, instead of having Gail's lawyers tell a partial version of it to a jury before you can respond." She paused. "But you knew that when you came to that node room. You'd already decided." Another silence. Shorter. "Yes," he said. "Tell her yes." She relayed it to Voss. Voss said the call would be made in 10 minutes and to keep Marsh available. The radio went quiet. The vehicle moved through the city with the steady momentum of a situation that had been wound to its absolute limit and was now, in some structural sense, beginning to release. Not over. Not clean. But releasing. The specific feeling of tension converting to something with direction rather than just pressure. The secondary location was 40 minutes out. Her mother was there, and Daniel, and the particular complicated aftermath of a family that was going to have to learn a new version of itself now that the buried thing had been exhumed and named and put in front of people with the authority to do something about it. She looked out the window. The city was doing what cities did, moving past her, indifferent, generating its ordinary life in the margins of everything that had just happened. She watched it and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the unresolved grief and the particular weight of her father's voice still in her ear, something that she recognized only slowly and with some suspicion because it had been absent long enough that she'd stopped expecting it. The thing she felt was not peace. It was not happiness. It was something more durable than both. The feeling of a person who has been living inside a problem and has finally, after a very long time, found the outside edge of it. She was still inside it. She knew that. The warrants were executing and the lawyers were mobilizing, and Martin Gale had resources she hadn't fully mapped. And the next 72 hours were going to be the kind of thing she'd be processing for years. She knew all of that with the clear, unsentimental precision that 6 years of analytical work had built into her like structural rebar, but she could feel the outside edge. And that was new. "How far to the secondary location?" she said to Craw. 38 minutes. She settled back in the seat. 38 minutes. She would use some of them to sleep and some of them to think, and when she arrived, she would walk into the room where her mother was, and she would say something true, and Eleanor Mercer would look at her with the specific, composed steadiness of a woman who had been managing enormous truths for a very long time, and they would begin the work of being something other than what the secret had made them. Vincent, beside her, had gone back to the tablet, the specific, absorbed focus of a man already working on the next problem. She almost said something. She stopped herself. Instead, she closed her eyes. Outside, the city moved past them in the gray afternoon, carrying its ordinary weight, not knowing and not needing to know that somewhere inside it, on a drive the size of a thumb in a woman's jacket pocket, a dead man's voice had been waiting 19 years to finish what he'd started. And tonight, finally, with 38 minutes left in a journey that had taken nearly 3 weeks and cost more than she'd known she had, it was going to... She slept for 22 minutes. She knew the exact duration because she'd looked at the clock when her eyes closed and looked at it again when Craw said 2 minutes out, and the math was 22 minutes, which was not enough, and was also, somehow, exactly what her body had taken and released her from without asking permission. The sleep had been absolute. No dreams, no half-consciousness, just the specific black absence of a system that had finally hit its floor and shut down long enough to restart. She came back to herself with the drive still in her jacket pocket, and Vincent still beside her, and the afternoon light through the window now lower and more orange, the specific color of late autumn days in the northeast when the sun gave up early and left the sky with that thin provisional quality that said winter was close. The secondary location was a farmhouse. Real farmhouse, not the aesthetic kind. Working barn attached, fields gone to late season brown, a gravel drive that ran a quarter-mile through tree line before the building appeared, the kind of place that existed in the middle of things and looked like the edge of them. Eleanor Mercer was standing on the porch when the vehicle stopped. Isla got out. She looked at her mother, who looked back at her, and between them the distance of the gravel drive compressed into the specific weight of everything that had happened since the night Isla had opened the door of Mercer Hall. Eleanor was wearing a coat that wasn't hers, borrowed from whoever owned this property. And her hair was different from how Isla was used to seeing it, looser, and she looked older than she had 3 weeks ago in the way that people aged in concentrated time when the pretense that had been holding years in suspension finally dissolved. Isla walked up the porch steps. Eleanor put both hands on her face the way she'd done when Isla was very young and hurt and needed to be looked at directly and assessed. She looked at her daughter's face for a long moment, taking inventory the way only mothers did, measuring the damage against the baseline of a person she'd known from the very beginning. "You're all right," Eleanor said. Not a question. "Yes." "You're not sleeping." "I slept 22 minutes. Eleanor's hands came down. She looked past Isla to where Vincent was getting out of the vehicle, and the expression on her face was the one Isla had been trying to read since the night he'd walked into Mercer Hall. Not quite recognition. Something more specific than that. "Mrs. Mercer," Vincent said from the base of the porch steps. "I know who you are," Eleanor said. "I've known who you were for longer than you probably think." She looked at him for another moment. "Your father was a decent man. I want you to know I've believed that for a long time." Something happened in Vincent's face that Isla had not seen happen there before, not in 18 days of watching it for information. It didn't collapse. It was still the face of a man who'd spent decades managing what his face did. But something underneath it moved, and the movement was visible briefly before the control reasserted itself. "Thank you," he said. It came out quieter than his usual register. The quietness of something genuine. Eleanor nodded once and went inside, and Isla understood that her mother had been carrying this particular piece of knowledge, that Nathan had known Robert Ashcroft, that the connection existed, for some portion of the years since Nathan's death, and the carrying of it had had the same shape as the carrying of all the other things Eleanor Mercer had managed in silence over a long life of managing things in silence. Not comfortable, not resolved. Carried. Daniel was in the kitchen. He was 24 years old and had their father's eyes and their mother's jaw, and he'd been sitting at the kitchen table with his hands around a mug for what looked like several hours, doing the particular suspended thing that younger siblings did when the older one was handling something they weren't fully inside of. He looked up when Isla came in, and the look was a question he didn't know how to phrase. She sat down across from him. She put the drive on the table between them. "Everything that happened," she said, "what Dad did, what it cost, what he spent 20 years trying to fix. It's on that drive." Daniel looked at the drive. "Did it work? The fixing?" "All of it." She thought about that. The warrants executing in real time somewhere in Manhattan, Martin Gale in federal custody, Voss working through documents with 2 trusted people, Marsh writing in a legal pad, the vault in New Jersey still open, still waiting to be fully processed by people with the authority to process it. "It's working," she said. "It's not the same thing." He picked up the drive, turned it over in his hands, set it down. Is it... He stopped. Was he bad? It was the question she'd been carrying since page 7 of Robert Ashcroft's handwritten timeline. The question she'd run through every analytical framework she had and arrived each time at an answer that refused to be simple. "No," she said. He wasn't bad. He was scared and he made a decision that had consequences he spent the rest of his life trying to outrun, and he never did outrun them. She met her brother's eyes. I've spent 18 days being angry at him, and the anger is real, and it's not going to go away in a hurry, but he was not bad. He was a man who loved us more than he loved the right thing, and that's the most human failing there is, and I can hold both of those things at the same time without one of them canceling the other. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the slow particular acknowledgement of a young man receiving information that was going to take years to fully metabolize, and stood up and put his arms around her, and she let him, and they stood in the kitchen of the borrowed farmhouse in the fading afternoon light, and held each other the way siblings held each other when the architecture of their shared history had just been revised at the foundation. She left him with the mug and went back outside. Vincent was on the porch. He was on the phone, the satellite unit, and his voice was low and specific, operational, the tone she'd heard him use when he was coordinating rather than deciding. She stood near the railing and waited. He ended the call. "The pursuing vehicles from this afternoon," he said. "Two of them have been identified, both registered to a logistics company that traces back to a Gale subsidiary we hadn't previously mapped. Where are they now?" "The federal warrant team is handling it. Voss flagged the subsidiary when I sent her the registrations 20 minutes ago." He put the phone in his pocket. "It's moving into channels we don't have to manage directly." She looked at him. The specific luxury of that sentence, channels we don't have to manage directly, was something she hadn't had access to in 18 days. It felt strange and also correct, the feeling of a weight being transferred rather than dropped. "Reeves," she said, "in federal custody as of this afternoon. He cooperated immediately, which tells me he was never a true believer, just a man who made a bad financial decision and then couldn't find the exit." "And Marsh?" "Proffer agreement signed 2 hours ago. He's been in a room with Voss's people since 3 o'clock. Vincent looked out at the tree line. The light was going now, the last of it pulling out of the sky with the unhurried resignation of late afternoon. "He'll be all right. It's going to be complicated, and he has a lot to account for, and all right isn't the same as easy. But he'll be all right." She absorbed that. Then, "Martin Gale." His lawyers filed a motion to suppress the primary recording within 40 minutes of the arrest. Judge denied it in under an hour. Something moved through his voice, not satisfaction, something quieter than that. Voss anticipated the motion and had the chain of custody documentation prepared in advance. She'd been building toward this for 2 years, and she knew exactly where his lawyers would go. "She's good. She's exceptional," he said. "She's been building the case she needed the Meridian evidence to complete without knowing the Meridian evidence existed. When we handed it to her, she had the frame already built. She just needed the center." Isla nodded. Outside, the barn at the property's edge threw a long shadow across the brown field. A bird moved through the shadow, low and purposeful, and was gone into the tree line. "Your organization," she said. He turned to look at her. "The compound, the Tribeca floor, Craw, and the others. The 19 years of infrastructure you built." She held his gaze. "What happens to it now?" He was quiet for a moment that had the quality of something he'd been thinking about for longer than tonight. "Ashcroft Capital Partners files a restructuring next week. The legitimate holdings, there are real ones, significant ones, built over years alongside the other work, transition into a registered private intelligence and security firm. Licensed, regulated, contracted primarily to federal and private clients who need the kind of capability we have without the liability of building it internally. You go legitimate. I go documented," he said. Legitimate implies the previous state was entirely illegitimate, which isn't accurate. It implies the transition is a moral correction rather than a structural one, which also isn't accurate. What it is sustainable. The previous state wasn't sustainable. I've known that for a long time. "Your father told you to get out," she said. 2 days before he died." "Yes." "And you didn't." "I needed the reach to do what I was trying to do." He said it without defensiveness, just fact. "I also needed to believe I was the kind of person who could exist at that level and remain oriented. I think I mostly succeeded at that. I think mostly isn't always enough, and I think the parts of it that weren't enough are going to take a while to account for." He paused. I've been aware of that for longer than this case. The case just gave it a timeline. She looked at him. The last of the light was going now, the porch dropping into the gray that preceded full dark. And in the gray, his face had the quality of something that had been simplified by exhaustion down to its essential features. Honest and tired and more uncertain than the operational version of him ever permitted to be visible. You came to my door because you needed an analyst, she said. Yes? And because the secondary authentication required a Mercer voice. Yes. Were those the only reasons? He looked at her for a moment, the honest pause of a man deciding whether to be precise or careful and choosing precision. No. I came to your door because your father trusted mine, and because when I read your professional record, I found someone who built things the way I build things, without sentiment, with full awareness of cost, for reasons that went past the obvious ones. He held her gaze. I thought you'd understand what we were trying to do in a way that most people wouldn't. And if I'd refused, I'd have found another analyst and spent 5 years failing to access the vault and eventually died without resolving it. He said it without drama. The Mercer voice requirement was either going to be the thing that made it possible or the thing that made it impossible. There was no middle option. She looked at the tree line. The bird was gone. The field was entirely in shadow now. When Voss finishes processing the vault contents, she said, and the trial begins, and it will be a long trial, with his lawyers filing everything they can find, I'll need to testify. Yes. About the vault access, about the chain of custody, about the analytical work that led to Martin Gale's name. Yes. That testimony will reference my father extensively. Yes. And the press coverage of the trial will as well. Yes, he said, it will. I can't change that. I told you on the first night that if you found something I didn't want to find, you should tell me anyway. The corollary is that what you found becomes part of the record, and the record becomes public, and I don't have a mechanism to prevent that. I know. She turned back from the tree line and looked at him directly. I'm not asking you to prevent it. I'm telling you I understand what it costs. I want you to understand that I understand it, so we don't have to pretend later that I didn't know. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, she said. Inside the farmhouse, she could hear Eleanor and Daniel. Voices, low, the particular cadence of two people managing the same grief from different angles, finding the places where their versions of it overlapped and sitting in those places together. The sound of a family doing the work that families did after the thing happened, which was rarely what people expected it to be, and was almost always just this: two people in a kitchen talking in low voices while the darkness came down outside. Voss called at 7:43 p.m. Isla took the call on the porch with Vincent beside her. The primary recording has been formally entered into evidence, Voss said. The chain of custody documentation has been verified by 2 independent forensic analysts and certified. Suppression motion denied, and the denial has been upheld on expedited appeal. Gale's lawyers tried to leapfrog to the circuit, but the judge wasn't having it. A pause that held the particular quality of a person looking at something they've been building toward for a long time. The financial documentation is going to take weeks to fully process, but the initial forensic accounting confirms the shell structure and the fund flows. We have enough to proceed on multiple counts. The letters, Isla said, in evidence, in context. The recording of Robert Ashcroft's testimony provides the framing for Nathan Mercer's role as a coerced witness rather than a voluntary participant. The prosecution's narrative is built around Gale's coercion as a primary tool. Your father's compliance is a data point in that narrative rather than a separate prosecution. Voss paused. His name will be in the record. His role will be in the record. But the record will also contain his own testimony, his own account, in his own voice. He gets to tell his own story as part of the documentation of what was done to him. Isla breathed. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This trial is going to take 18 months, and Gale's legal team is exceptional, and there will be days when it looks like it might go wrong. I need you available, and I need your testimony clean, and I need you to understand that what we have is strong, but not invulnerable. I understand. Good. I'll be in touch Monday with the formal witness documentation. A pause. Ms. Mercer, the work you did on the network analysis, identifying the Castellan connection, mapping the shell structure, finding Gale's name inside an infrastructure that his lawyers had spent 19 years making findable by no one. That work is exceptional. If you're looking for something to do when this is finished, I can think of several people who would like to talk to you. Isla was quiet for a moment. Ask me in 18 months, the boss almost smiled. She could hear it in the pause. Fair enough? Monday? The line went dead. She put the phone in her pocket. Beside her, Vincent was looking at the field. The dark was fully down now, the tree line absorbed into it, and the farmhouse windows threw yellow light onto the porch boards in rough rectangles that moved slightly when someone inside moved past them. 18 months, she said. At minimum, Vincent said. These cases run long. The financial charges alone will generate 18 months of motions. Are you prepared for that? I've been prepared for 19 years. He said it without bitterness, just the weight of a fact that had shaped a life. A trial is a contained form of waiting. I know how to wait. She looked at the dark field. What do you do, she said, when the waiting ends? He was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. He was looking at the field too, and his face in the yellow window light had the quality she'd noticed in the Tribeca floor that morning, tired in the deep structural way, and underneath the tiredness something that was trying to figure out its new shape. I don't know yet, he said. I've been building toward a specific resolution for so long that the landscape past it is unclear. A pause. I think that's probably how it should feel. Yes, she said. I think it is. They stood on the porch in the dark for a while, not in silence exactly. The farmhouse behind them was filled with the small sounds of people existing in proximity, and outside the field had its own sounds. The late-season sound of wind through dry grass, the occasional distant sound of the road half a mile away carrying ordinary traffic to ordinary destinations. After a while, she went inside. Eleanor had made something in the borrowed kitchen, nothing elaborate, the kind of food that appeared when someone needed to do something with their hands, and feeding people was the available instrument. She set a plate in front of Isla without asking, and Isla ate it without tasting it, and felt, in the eating, the specific animal gratitude of a body finally receiving what it needed. Daniel was quieter than usual through the meal. He ate with the focused concentration of a young man thinking harder than he was talking, which had been a trait of Nathan's that Yela had always recognized in him, and was recognizing now with the particular doubled vision that the last 18 days had given her. The ability to see her father in her brother's gestures and feel it as something other than simple loss. Something that was loss and also continuation. The specific human stubbornness of traits that outlasted the person who'd carried them first. After the meal, Eleanor washed the dishes, which she did when she needed the activity and the warm water and the particular small ceremony of putting used things back in order. Isla stood beside her and dried them, the way she'd done at age 9 and age 16 and age 22 when she'd been home from college and the kitchen had been different, but the motion had been the same. Her mother washing, her drying, the two of them in parallel without the obligation of conversation, which was its own kind of talking. He recorded himself, Isla said, after a while, for the vault. He told me, told whoever was listening, that he'd designed it for me to find. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her hands in the water. I know. Isla looked at her. You knew about the vault. I knew about the recording. Eleanor didn't look up from the sink. He told me the year before he died, when the illness made it clear there wasn't going to be time to finish the way he'd hoped. She paused. He said he'd put something away for you. He said you were the only person who'd be able to reach it, and the only person who'd know what to do with it when you did. She picked up a glass and handed it to Isla. He was right. Were you angry? At what specifically? At all of it. The choice he made, the years of silence, Isla stopped. The glass was warm in her hands. Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness she gave to questions that deserved it. I was angry for a long time before I understood the full shape of it, she said. I knew more than you knew. I understood earlier that the silence wasn't simple, that there was something underneath the ordinary life that he was managing in parallel. I didn't know the details. I knew the weight. She washed another dish. By the time he told me about the recording, I'd already done most of the being angry. What was left was something else. What? Grief for what he had to carry alone. Eleanor's voice was entirely even. He wouldn't tell me the details because he was protecting me, which is the same decision he made in the beginning, protecting us over the right thing. And by the end of his life, he still couldn't break the pattern, even when the protective impulse was directed at something that didn't need protecting anymore. She handed Isla another glass. He was a man with one very deep flaw, and it wore the same face his whole life. That flaw was love, which doesn't excuse it, but it does explain the shape of it. Isla dried the glass. He apologized to me, she said. In the recording, he said he was afraid I'd decide the truth made him someone other than who he was to me. Does it? She thought about it the way she thought about things that mattered, fully, without rushing toward the answer she wanted. It makes him more, she said. More complete. More real. I knew a version of him, and now I know the whole version, and the whole version is harder to hold, but it's also more, him. More the actual person rather than the one I constructed from the parts he let me see. She set the glass on the counter. I'd rather have the whole version, even now. Eleanor looked at her daughter then, directly, with the particular clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had survived a great deal and expected both others and herself to do the same. Good, she said. That's the right answer. It's the true one, Isla said. I'm not sure about right. When they're the same thing, Eleanor said, don't second-guess it. She went to bed at 11. The room was small and the bed was someone else's, and the sheets were unfamiliar, and none of that mattered because she was horizontal and the drive was on the nightstand and the phone was on silent, and sleep came within 4 minutes of her eyes closing, which was the fastest she'd slept in 3 weeks. She dreamed about the rope swing, the maple tree and the neighbor's dog, and the arc of being 7 years old and finding everything funny. Her father's hands at her back, pushing, and his voice saying the thing he said when he thought no one was listening. This is exactly enough. In the dream, she said it back to him, which hadn't happened in the actual afternoon. She'd been too busy laughing, and in the dream he heard it, and the sound he made wasn't quite a word. She woke at 6:15 to pale light through the farmhouse curtains, and the smell of coffee from somewhere downstairs, and the specific bodily awareness of a person who has slept a real sleep after an extended period of not sleeping. The mild heaviness of it, the way the body held the bed for a moment before accepting that continuation was necessary. She lay still for a minute, maybe 2. Then she got up. Craw was in the kitchen. He'd made coffee and he handed her a cup without comment, which was the most eloquent thing about him. The economy of it, the reading of the room, the absence of performance. She'd spent 18 days watching Vincent's people, and she'd cataloged Craw as the steadiest of them, which was not a small thing in the organization he worked for. What time does Vincent leave? She said. He's not leaving, Craw said. He's in the barn. She took her coffee to the barn. It was a working barn in the way that working barns were, functional, cold, smelling of old wood and dry hay, and the specific organic mustiness of a space that had contained animals within living memory. Vincent was at the far end, sitting on a hay bale with his phone face down beside him and his coat on and his coffee going cold in the same way hers had gone cold in the Tribeca floor the night before. He looked up when she came in. He looked, in the barn light, like a man who had also just slept for the first time in a long time and was still in the early stages of reclaiming his own face from the operational version that had been running it. Craw makes good coffee, she said. Yes. He picked up his cup and drank it cold without complaint. Voss sent a message at 5 a.m. Gale's lawyers filed 2 additional motions overnight, both denied. She anticipated them. Something moved through his expression. The specific thing that moved through people's expressions when they watched someone else's competence operate at a level that met their standards. She's extraordinary. Isla sat on the hay bale across from him. The barn was cold, and the light coming through the slats was the early thin light that hadn't committed to warmth yet. Outside, she could hear the field doing what fields did in early morning. The wind, the birds beginning their inventory of the day, the specific silence that wasn't silence but was the absence of human noise. "I listened to the full recording last night," she said. "My father's. I'd only heard part of it before." Vincent looked at her. "And?" "He named Gail, specifically with enough operational detail that it corroborates Robert's recording without being derivative of it. He was working from his own documentation, his own timeline. The two recordings together they're the same picture drawn by two different hands, which is what prosecutors call corroboration, and what it actually is two men who saw the same thing and couldn't speak to each other and still told the same story." "Yes," Vincent said. "Your father wasn't alone," she said. "I want you to know that. He thought he was alone, and he wasn't. My father was working toward the same resolution from inside the silence. He just couldn't tell anyone he was doing it." Vincent looked at his cold cup. "I know," he said. "I've known since the fourth letter. It didn't make 19 years easier, but I've known." She nodded. They sat in the cold barn with their cold coffee and the field going about its morning business outside, and the silence between them had the quality of two people who had traveled a long distance together and arrived somewhere neither of them had been before and were taking a moment to look at where they were. "I want to talk about what comes next," she said. "For the trial or for the work." She held his gaze. "What you said about the restructuring, the legitimate firm, the registered intelligence and security operation." She paused. "I've been running analytical work in borrowed frameworks my whole career. Hargrove Systems. Your network. Whatever the next employer's infrastructure was going to be." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I'm not interested in borrowed frameworks anymore." He looked at her steadily. "What are you interested in?" "Building something that can do what the last 3 weeks required, but inside a structure that doesn't need to operate outside the law to have the reach it needs." She met his eyes. "That's a different kind of organization than what you've had. It requires different partnerships, different compliance architecture, different client relationships. It requires someone who can build the analytical infrastructure from the ground up and maintain it in a way that survives regulatory scrutiny." "Yes," he said, "it does." "I'm not talking about employment," she said. "I've been employed. I'm talking about building something." He looked at her for a long moment. The barn light had warmed slightly, the early thin quality giving way to something more solid as the morning committed to itself. His face in the warmer light was the most relaxed she'd seen it since the steps of Mercer Hall, which was not very relaxed and was still more real than the controlled version had been. "That's a conversation that requires more than one morning," he said. "I know. I'm telling you I want to have it." "Then we'll have it." She nodded. They finished their coffee. She stood up first, and he stood a moment after, and they walked back to the farmhouse through the field that was coming up gold in the morning light, the dry grass doing its small movements in the wind, the tree line at the property's edge solid and dark and unconcerned. The formal proceedings took 11 months, not the full trial. That was still building when the first major convictions came. The financial charges carrying first, the procurement fraud case that Voss had been assembling for 2 years, finally closing around Gale's network with the specific irrevocability of evidence that had been prepared too carefully to be dismantled. 3 senior directors of Castellan Group pled in the first 6 months. The 2 federal officials who had redirected and suppressed investigation 19 years ago were charged in month 8, retired by then, both of them, which had not protected them the way they'd apparently assumed retirement would. Martin Gale went to trial in month 11. The trial lasted 4 months. Isla testified for 3 days. She was precise, undefensive, and completely composed on the stand, which the press described as cold, and which was not cold, but was the specific clarity of a woman who had looked at every piece of what she was about to say, dozens of times from every angle, and knew its shape completely, and had no need to be anything other than accurate about it. The jury was out for 9 hours. The verdict, when it came, was not the cathartic event that people who hadn't been through such things imagined it would be. It was quiet. It was a number read by a clerk in a courtroom, and then a series of logistical events, the gavel, the instruction, the removal. Voss shook Isla's hand afterward in the hallway with the measured warmth of a woman who expressed satisfaction through precision rather than volume. Your father's recordings, Voss said, were the turning point, both of them. The jury watched the parking structure footage and then watched Nathan Mercer describe what it had cost him to protect that footage for 20 years, and the sequencing of that, the specific human weight of it. I've seen evidence move juries before. That moved them differently. Good, Isla said. That's what he intended. She went home. Not Mercer Hall. They hadn't lived there in the months since the night it was evacuated, and the property had been sold in the interim, a decision Eleanor had made with the decisive finality she brought to decisions she'd already made internally long before they were formally reached. The family was in a house in Hartford now, smaller, unremarkable, the kind of house that was a house rather than an estate, which suited all three of them better than any of them had expected. She sat in the kitchen of that house the night after the verdict and called Vincent. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been expecting the call or had been near the phone, and she didn't ask which. "It's done," she said. "I know," he said. "I was watching the coverage." "Robert Ashcroft's name is in the public record now," she said. "The full story. What he did, what he tried to do, what it cost him." She paused. "He's remembered correctly." A silence from his end that held the weight of 19 years and the specific quality of a weight finally set down. "Yes," he said. "He is. Are you all right?" "I'll let you know, Imaz," he said. "I think so. Ask me again in a year." "I will," she said. She meant it. That was the thing she'd learned among the many things in the last 12 months. The value of meaning what you said when you said it, without the elaborate hedging that came from trying to account for all the ways things might change. Things would change. They always did. That didn't make the statement less true in the moment of making it. She ended the call and sat in the quiet kitchen. The house settled around her with the small sounds of a lived-in place, the refrigerator, the window doing something with the wind outside, the particular creak of the second stair that she'd learned to avoid when her mother was sleeping. On the kitchen table, in a padded envelope that had arrived 3 days ago from a federal evidence processing unit in Lower Manhattan, were the 22 letters. Voss had arranged their return once the evidentiary processing was complete. They'd been photocopied and entered into the official record, and the originals had been released back to the family with the understated bureaucratic courtesy of an office that had spent the last 11 months handling something larger than its usual caseload. Isla opened the envelope and took them out and stacked them on the table the way she'd first seen them in Vincent's safe. 19 years of Robert Ashcroft's careful, frightened, determined voice organized by date. She was not going to return them to Vincent tonight. She was going to read them again, slowly, all 22 of them, now that she had the full picture they'd been written into. She was going to read them the way they deserved to be read. Not for analysis, not for evidence, not for the pattern they were part of, but for the man who wrote them. A man who had been afraid and alone and had addressed his words with a particular stubborn defiance to someone he didn't know and couldn't name, and had trusted that the address would eventually find its destination. She read for 3 hours. The letters were the same letters. They said what they'd said in the safe and in the vault room and in the farmhouse office and in every context she'd read them in over the past 11 months. But they were different now in the way that things were different when you knew all the events they'd preceded. When you could hold the beginning and the ending in the same hands and feel the full span of what ran between them. At the end of the 22nd letter, Robert Ashcroft had written, in the smaller, compressed handwriting of his final weeks, "I don't know if justice is the right word for what I'm hoping for. Justice suggests a balance that I'm not sure the world operates by. What I'm hoping for is something more specific, that the people who deserve to understand what happened are given the means to understand it. That's enough. That's all I'm asking the future to do. Just understand it correctly, and let what follows from that be what it is." She set the letter down. The kitchen was very quiet. The house was quiet. Outside, Hartford was doing what cities did at 11 p.m., the specific hushed activity of a place not fully asleep, the occasional car, the wind, the ambient electronic hum of infrastructure running through the dark on its own. On her phone, a message from Vincent, sent while she'd been reading, which meant he'd been thinking about her while she'd been thinking about him, which was a coincidence she didn't examine too carefully. The message said, "The firm's licensing cleared today. We're operational as of Monday. The conversation we said we'd have. I think the time is right, if you do." She looked at the message for a moment. The 22 letters on the table, the padded envelope, the window with the city dark outside it. She thought about the rope swing, the vault, the node room and the carafe, and the letter opener on the hall table of a house that no longer belonged to her family. She thought about her father's voice saying, "This is exactly enough," and what it meant that she'd been the one to give that phrase back to the vault, and what it meant that the vault had accepted it. She typed back, "Monday works. Send me the address." She put her phone face down on the table beside the letters. She sat with them for a while longer. The letters and the quiet and the particular feeling of standing at the end of one kind of life and the beginning of another, which was not peaceful exactly and was not frightening exactly, but was the specific charged stillness of a threshold moment, the held breath of something that had not yet resolved into whatever it was going to become. She reached out and straightened the stack of letters. They sat in a neat pile on the table, no longer bound by the crumbled rubber band, no longer hidden behind a combination she hadn't known, and a safe she hadn't been invited to open. They sat in the light like what they were, evidence of a man's long attempt to make one true thing outlast him, and proof that it had. She left them on the table when she went to bed. Not filed away, not returned to the envelope. Just there, in the open, where anyone who came into the kitchen in the morning would see them. Not hidden, not protected, not buried under the weight of what they contained. Just letters, resting in an unlocked place, the way the truth finally rested when it had nowhere left to hide and nothing left to fear from being found.